Thank you for your patience. You good over there? Okay. Good morning and welcome to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission's third hearing of the 2026 annual report cycle. I would like to thank our witnesses for joining us here today and for the time you've put into preparing your testimonies and the time you've taken to travel. Thank you also to the Senate Commerce Committee for allowing us to use their hearing room and to the Senate's recording studio for their assistance live streaming this event. I'd also like to thank our terrific USCC staff for the work you have done to organize this hearing. As a reminder, all written testimonies and a transcript of this hearing will be posted on our website, uscc.gov. Today, we will examine how China has been advancing its strategic and economic interest in Latin America, specifically how Chinese investment models and influence in the region are evolving. As our neighbors to the south, Latin America is vital to U.S. national security, and this discussion is timely as the United States reevaluates its strategy in the region. China's strategy in Latin America continues to shift from one focused primarily on trade and resource acquisition into one that seeks to create long-term structural influence through control of infrastructure, logistics networks, and governance institutions. For example, Chinese companies have taken significant ownership stakes in strategic energy and transportation infrastructure across Latin America. While much of this investment may be welcomed for bringing scarce capital, experience has shown it can also create potential security vulnerabilities and be used by Beijing as a source of leverage over regional governments. Specifically, Chinese companies control 57% of Chile's energy grid, 12% of Brazil's energy grid, and 100% of the grid in and around Peru's capital. Particularly concerning is the network of ports over which China has amassed influence. Chinese companies own or operate at least 10 ports around the region and are constructing and equipping significantly more, giving China access to valuable data, may provide a foothold for an expanded presence of China's military in the Western Hemisphere, and could threaten regional trade and U.S. military logistics in the event of a crisis. Beijing also hopes to dominate the region's technology ecosystem with particular focus on AI and digital connectivity. Through these efforts, China exercises its influence to maintain access to critical commodities, increase market access for Chinese firms, gain support for Chinese initiatives and policies in international organization, and marginalize Taiwan diplomatically. Chinese infrastructure projects have also been linked to corruption scandals. Chinese companies use bribery and opaque procurement processes to secure contracts in the region for projects such as a dam in Ecuador, roads in Bolivia, and ports and other infrastructure in Panama. Chinese companies have secured favorable changes to local laws, as when Peruvian government retroactively granted exclusive operation rights to the Chinese state-owned company building the Chancay megaport. Furthermore, Chinese companies are driving environmental degradation, disregarding regulations around pollution and deforestation. China is also following a strategy we discussed last year in our study of its activities in Southeast Asia and Pacific Islands and in our work on scam centers. China seeks to use non-traditional security cooperation to expand its influence in Latin America. Beijing is looking to use cooperation on transnational crime issues to deepen ties with police and security forces in the region, and then to leverage those ties into greater influence with national governments. The United States has a direct interest in Latin America's stability and effective governance, both of which are threatened by malign Chinese influence. I look forward to the insights our witnesses will offer that will help inform an effective policy response. I will now turn the floor over to my colleague and co-chair for this hearing, Commissioner Josh Hodges.
Thank you, Commissioner Price, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I also want to thank the USCC staff who've done an amazing job putting together the hearing. I want to start with something direct. This hearing is long overdue. The Chinese Communist Party has spent the better part of 2 decades executing a deliberate, systematic campaign to embed itself in the economic, military, and critical infrastructure systems across Latin America and the Caribbean. It's done so patiently, strategically, and largely while Washington looked the other way, often unwittingly helped by U.S.-backed financial institutions. This hearing seeks to shine a light on the CCP's hidden hand in the region and what that looks like in practice and the results of that. From the lending, the leverage, the coercion, and the crime, with a view toward what can be learned to ensure we avoid future predatory activity. And I want to start with the money because the numbers tell a story that's impossible to dismiss once you see it. Over the last 20 years, Chinese state policy banks, the China Development Bank and China Export-Import Bank of China, lent more than $123 billion to governments across the region alone. Nearly half of that went to Venezuela. That was not development finance, that was deliberate strategy to prop up a corrupt, anti-democratic regime in exchange for oil, political alignment, and a reliable anti-American vote in international forums. Chinese surveillance technology was sold to Caracas and used to monitor and suppress Venezuelan people. We should call that what it is, Beijing using predatory financial tools to export a CCP-style transformation into our hemisphere. And Venezuela is not the only cautionary tale. Ecuador took billions in Chinese debt tied to opaque energy contracts. Argentina signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative and became a top recipient of Chinese commercial bank lending in the region. In 2016, China leveraged its position in Argentina to stop an environmental review of Chinese-backed hydropower project, a direct interference in a sovereign regulatory process. These are not isolated events, they're a pattern. The economic footprint extends well beyond lending. China is now South America's largest trading partner and runs a trade surplus with most countries in the region. This commission reported last year on China Shock 2.0, the serious demonstrable harm done to economies and workers around the world as China dumps its massive excess industrial production on global markets. The CCP efforts are designed to give it increased control over vital assets in our hemisphere, from rare earths to ports to food to energy. The Western Hemisphere is the breadbasket of the world, and China is seeking to position itself as the dominant player in that region. China's also proven adept at using multilateral institutions as vectors of influence. Since the early 2010s, Chinese officials have exploited the IDB, an institution funded substantially by American taxpayers, to broker Chinese business across the hemisphere, to open doors for them and to give them immediate access to businesses over American businesses. This was most likely done unwittingly, but it certainly served the Chinese goals. I've studied this record closely. It's not a coincidence, it's a strategy. When countries have pushed back successfully, Beijing has adapted. Honduras is a great example of how this works. In 2023, it switched its democratic recognition from Taiwan to the PRC, lured by promises of trade and investment. What it got instead was the collapse of its shrimp and construction industries. During his 2025 campaign, Honduras president ran on a promise of restoring recognition to Taiwan. That tells you everything you need to know about the real value of China's promises. What concerns me most as we look forward, China's not standing still. Greenfield investments from Beijing has surged 68% from pre-pandemic levels as China's repositions to circumvent trade barriers being erected against its subsidized exports. And while headline lending figures appear to be falling, financial flows have become deliberately harder to track. We do not have a clear picture of how much state-backed capital is currently financing these Chinese company operations across the region. That opacity is not accidental. We know they want to control the future of AI, the future of energy, the future of telecommunications, and the infrastructure across the region so they can be the dominant player. The United States has a genuine, durable interest in this hemisphere, political, economic, and personal. The people of this country have deep ties in Latin America, and we've got to continue supporting that and find ways to change the current model that the Chinese have spent the CCP has spent the last 20 years fomenting. We know American private sector and American business model can clearly outperform the Chinese approach, and as the Commission looks over the horizon to how the U.S. can best combat predatory practices and ensure the hemisphere is protected from a military capability, economic security perspective, we appreciate your testimony today. Thank you.
Our first panel will present an overview of China's strategic approach to Latin America. It will look at the goals of PRC influence, as well as Beijing's principal political and economic tools for creating leverage. We'll start by welcoming back Ms. Margaret Myers, Senior Advisor to the Asia and Latin American Program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Ms. Myers has published extensively on the political economy of China's relations with the Latin American and Caribbean region. Her testimony will discuss Beijing's evolving goals for engaging with Latin America, their alignment with the PRC's broader foreign policy objectives, and how they might change in the future. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Parsifal de Sola, founder and executive director of the Andres Bello Foundation's China Latin American Research Center. In 2019, he served as a foreign policy advisor on China for Venezuela's interim government. His testimony will discuss how China's enhanced engagement strategy has moved from a primarily economic focus to a broader strategy aimed at building political influence. We'll also focus particularly on Venezuela as a case study. Third, we'll hear from Dr. Victoria Chonn Ching, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Her work has examined Chinese investment in Latin America and highlighted host country agency, economic statecraft, and the dynamics between foreign and domestic policymaking. Her testimony will discuss how China's attempts to build economic influence in Latin America are changing as it deepens its economic ties to the region. Both Mr. De Sola and Dr. Chonn Ching are new voices to the Commission. Thank you. Thank you all very much for being here today, and the Commission is looking forward to your remarks. I ask that all of our witnesses please keep their remarks to 7 minutes. Ms. Myers, we'll begin with you.
Co-chairs Hodges and Price, distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The underlying drivers of China's engagement with the region have proven quite durable over time and continue to sustain the relationship. China continues to rely on the region, as we've heard already, right, as a supplier of key commodities and as a market for increasing exports. High-tech Chinese goods are entering Latin American markets with growing intensity, as are lower-value consumer products at increasingly high rates. Latin America also remains central to China's food and broader supply chain security. If anything, trade is deepening and remains, in my view, the primary vehicle for China's influence across the hemisphere. But over time, China's engagement has also given way to a more selective, strategically calibrated posture that is important for U.S. policymakers to understand. The often commodity-backed loan agreements that once defined Beijing's financial engagement with the region have been replaced with a more selective, risk-aware, and strategic approach to cross-border finance. The value of Chinese FDI flows to the region has also slowed, and Latin America's relative share of investment under China's signature Belt and Road Initiative fell in recent years. These changes are due in very large part to a shift among Chinese companies away from large infrastructure initiatives towards smaller, often market-seeking projects in sectors of Chinese interest, especially at the higher end of the value chain. China is not leaving the region by any means and is already embedded in strategic infrastructure, as the co-chairs have noted, but is in many ways, or in cases, recalibrating in light of shifting conditions. Political considerations will also increasingly impact decision-making. Chinese companies and Latin American governments are both more seriously weighing the costs of engagement, with an effect on overall capital flows. Recent U.S. efforts to halt projects of strategic concern, including through the sanctioning of officials in Chile and elsewhere, would appear to already be impacting prospective deal-making in the region, especially in those areas that Latin American governments perceive as triggering red lines for U.S. policymakers. Critical infrastructure, surveillance technology, intelligence partnerships, and projects that could be construed as generating vulnerabilities for the U.S. in the event of a future conflict. At the very least, host governments and Chinese actors alike would appear to be adopting a wait-and-see posture pending greater clarity on U.S. policy, or else a change of policy direction. In China, debates about the appropriate scope and pace of engagement with Latin America have resurfaced in a way not seen since the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao era. Of course, while U.S. pressure can certainly alter behavior at the margins, it will not fundamentally change the underlying structural components that underpin China-Latin America dynamics and cannot substitute for the deeper foundations of a competitive U.S. presence. Constructive U.S. engagement deployed through the widest possible range of economic and diplomatic instruments is, as outlined in my written testimony, is a critical component of any serious hemispheric strategy. The region is a major market for U.S. goods and investments, as was mentioned, right, and is an increasingly important node in the supply chains the U.S. is trying to shorten and secure. Deep integration with Latin America is an industrial policy tool as much as it is a foreign policy or a national security one. Subordinating or sacrificing foreign assistance, educational exchange, and diversified economic engagement in favor of a predominantly coercive approach risks undermining the foundation on which U.S. influence in the region has rested. It also cedes to China precisely the ground that the United States has worked to build over the course of many decades. As it stands, China's focus on people-to-people engagement is deepening, even as certain forms of economic activity slow somewhat. This is, I would argue, also an important and opportune moment to engage in an increasingly productive manner, right? On balance, recent U.S. actions in the region have generated mixed reception, often unfavorable reception, notwithstanding the efforts of some governments to signal alignment with Washington. But China's presence is also generating some tensions in the region. Latin American countries with significant industrial capacity, such as Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, are confronting the consequences of Chinese industrial policy with increasing concern and directness. In other cases, prior negative experiences have prompted greater scrutiny of incoming projects. Many countries are also seriously weighing the costs of overdependence on any one nation, including China. This moment presents the United States with a genuine opening. Growing regional unease about the displacing effects of Chinese trade generates demand for an alternative model, one that is defined by a commitment to supporting industrial development, building value chains rather than drawing from them, and engaging seriously with the region's own economic aspirations, so distinguishing from the China model entirely. Viewing this dynamic through a primarily national security lens will mean addressing only certain specific elements of China's positioning, albeit very important ones. Taking stock of the breadth and depth of Chinese engagement and how it affects the region, for better or worse, is critical at this juncture. And over the long term, I would suggest to you that only a competitive and productive alternative can compete effectively with China's structural influence in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. De Sola?
Commissioners Hodges and Price, distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. The perspective I bring today is grounded in how China's engagement is experienced from a South American vantage point. Let me begin with a simple point. There is no such thing as Latin America. The region is deeply fragmented, politically, economically, institutionally, hence China, and any other country for that matter, does not engage it as a unified space. It engages country by country, often subnationally, adapting to local conditions. If there's one takeaway from my testimony, let it be this. China's influence in Latin America is not imposed. It is mediated by local realities. To understand how China actually operates in the region, we need to move beyond aggregate trends and look at how its model performs under pressure. That is why I anchor my analysis in Venezuela. Not because it is representative, but because it is an outlier that reveals China's engagement dynamics when the outcome comes under stress. Venezuela was not simply one partner among many. Beginning in the 2000s, Caracas became one of Beijing's most politically exposed and financially intensive relationships in the region, combining large-scale lending, energy cooperation, and high-level political alignment. Then everything crumbled: economic collapse, institutional breakdown, sanctions, and ultimately US military intervention. No other country clusters all these elements, and that is precisely why it matters. What does Venezuela show? First, it shows how China's model expands. China entered Venezuela not simply because of oil, but because of politics. Under Hugo Chavez, Venezuela sought to position itself as a regional counterweight to the United States, and it was quite successful at that. China became part of that strategy. China did not just provide capital, it provided geopolitical backing. It gave Venezuela international legitimacy and room to pursue an anti-US regional project. Second, Venezuela shows how China adapts when conditions change. When Venezuela stopped being a political asset and became a source of instability, China recalibrated. Lending slowed and eventually stopped. Exposure was reduced. Risk was managed. But diplomatic support remained. This dual posture economic retrenchment combined with rhetorical continuity is not unique to Venezuela. It reflects a broader pattern. China adjusts to local conditions, but it does not publicly redefine relationships. Third, Venezuela exposes the core tension in China's engagement model. China defines its foreign policy as non-interventionist, and formally, that is true. It does not dictate political outcomes or impose governance conditions. But in practice, it becomes embedded in domestic systems. In Venezuela, Chinese technology, financing, and diplomatic support became part of a state undergoing democratic erosion. China did not cause this trajectory, but it was not external to it either. By defining its role as non-interventionist, China treats political and security outcomes as entirely endogenous, effectively placing them outside the scope of its responsibility. That is a key contradiction. China maintains a position of political detachment while operating inside political systems. Under stable conditions, this works, and it's attractive. For many countries, China provides something valuable: financing, infrastructure development, and the ability to diversify away from dependence on the United States. But as institutional conditions weaken, this separation becomes harder to sustain. China's engagement is not a root cause of democratic erosion, but it can reinforce it. Now, what happened on January 3rd? The removal of Nicolás Maduro is often interpreted as a test of China's commitment. That is the wrong way to look at it. It was not a failure of China's strategy. It was a clarification of its limits. China did not escalate because its model was never designed for hard power confrontation. Latin America is not a core security theater for Beijing. It lacks the military presence, institutional networks, and escalation capacity to compete in that domain. More importantly, by early 2026, Venezuela was no longer a strategic asset worth defending at a higher cost. China chose not to escalate, not because it couldn't, but simply because it didn't want to. This reveals something critical. Presence is not the same as leverage. China had deep economic and political ties in Venezuela, but when the situation shifted to coercive intervention, those ties did not translate into influence over outcomes. What does this mean for the region and for the United States? For years, Latin America operated under what I described as cheap ambiguity. Countries expanded economic ties with China while operating within a security environment deeply intertwined with the United States. As for China, it expanded without taking on security risks, nor the political consequences of its growing footprint. No one had to make hard choices. And to be fair, China does not have to care about the negative aspects of its engagement model. Today, Venezuela has disrupted that template. It showed that in moments of crisis, the asymmetry is real. The US remains the only actor capable of shaping outcomes through force. But here is where most analyses go wrong. This does not mean China is retreating. The structural conditions that have driven China's expansion remain intact. Massive infrastructure deficits, limited access to funding, and demand for diversified partnerships. China will continue to expand because it offers something the region needs. And finally, Latin American countries are not passive actors in this process. They actively shape their relationships with both China and the United States. The main risk for the US is not China's presence in the region. It is misdiagnosing why the presence exists in the first place. China has not displaced the United States. It entered where demand existed and where US engagement was limited or inconsistent. At the same time, the US has an advantage China cannot replicate, not economic, not military, but relational. People-to-people ties, diasporas, cultural affinity, institutional linkages, these are deep, durable, and generational. China's engagement, by contrast, is strong in sectors but shallow in society. That is your advantage. The fact that a Venezuelan national can appear before this commission to provide a testimony on matters of US policy speaks to a level of openness and integration that extends beyond traditional state-to-state relations. These are two-way relationships, sustained not only by governments but by societies. Nonetheless, these ties are not guaranteed. They can be eroded if US policy prioritizes control over partnership or stability over democratic outcomes. Let me close with this. The Venezuelan case is not just a warning about my country. It is a warning about how China's influence in Latin America actually works. China did not create Venezuela's collapse, but the case shows that its model can become deeply embedded in deteriorating political systems while remaining formally detached from outcomes that follow. That is the contradiction. China's presence in the region is real and durable, but is also limited and should not be overstated. It is strongest where local conditions invite it, and weakest where crisis force hard geopolitical choices. If those underlying conditions are not addressed, the cycle will repeat, perhaps with different actors, but with the same structural dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Chonn Ching.
Co-chairs Commissioner Hodges, Commissioner Price, and other esteemed members of the Commission. Thank you for letting me testify today. As a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, today I am testifying on my own capacity, so my testimony does not represent the Atlantic Council's views or positions. I hope this testimony helps the Commission to generate policies that lead to productive, sustainable, and constructive engagement with Latin American countries. The following are my observations based on my research, but also it includes some observations by other scholars. First, China's economic influence in Latin America has been consolidated through a pragmatic, strategically selective, and adjustable approach. The Latin America-China relationship has faced different periods of quick development, expansion, stagnation, re-engagement. During all this time, China's presence has been constant. However, it has also not been homogeneous. China has focused on building networks and economic structures that respond to many of the development interests that Latin American countries are pursuing. And this includes infrastructure investment, greater national and regional connectivity, green technology, and renewable energy. This means that Latin American countries have also been active participants in these bilateral exchanges. These have also changed according to administrations, ideological shifts, institutional challenges, and internal crisis in the region. Throughout this time, China has adjusted accordingly. This means that China is and has been playing a long game in the region. Today, given current uncertainties, China has indicated that it will remain a mutually beneficial partner that provides new or alternative deals and prioritizes diplomacy. And this helps China shaping the narrative in the region. Second, trade and investment in raw materials continue to be important drivers in China's economic exchanges, particularly those related to energy transition. China's trade and investment partners have followed its own economic plans, and right now it prioritizes green technology and energy transition. As a result, Latin America has gained prominence as a source of materials for clean energy technologies. China has also shifted its attention from mega investments to projects that are smaller or more focused on strategic areas. This means that at a regional level, FDI or foreign direct investment from China has been reduced. However, this does not mean that the projects are less relevant. In fact, since 2015, Latin America has seen an increase of infrastructure projects centered on transportation and connectivity. For instance, Colombia and Chile have used Chinese contractors to build their metro systems and purchase Chinese electric vehicles. Third, China seeks opportunities and exploits areas with gaps or where other players are not active. And it gets involved where it has actually competitive advantage. What does this mean? China's presence has underlined the absence or the divestment of assets by US companies or from other countries. For example, Chinese firms have made their entry into Latin America's hydropower sector following the exit of Brazil's Odebrecht after the 2014 Lava Jato scandal. Most recently, in 2020, the acquisition of US Sempra Energies in Peru, for example, has allowed China Three Gorges to enter Peru's hydropower sector. To reiterate, China continues to invest in areas that are key to the region's development goals and in which the US and other traditional partners have no focus on, namely closing infrastructure gaps, green technology, and mobility. Also, while there is a variety of Chinese firms, mostly SOEs or state-owned enterprises, they are not necessarily simply central. There are also SOEs from municipal and regional governments from China. In these cases, they have certain autonomy. However, at the end of the day, they still pursue national interests of resource seeking, but also market-oriented goals and expansion. Private companies are also important, and they include those that are part of the diaspora. Their participation in different chambers of commerce help us understand the complex economic networks that support China's influence and also its image in different Latin American countries. Also, Chinese firms' compliance and accountability depend on the host country's ability and capacity to enforce policies and ensure transparency. This means that it has resulted in the coordination and negotiation between multi-level government actors as well as local businesses, civil society, and local communities from the region, but also with Chinese firms. This means that Chinese firms will follow local regulations and standards insofar as the host country has the institutional structures and architecture to monitor to ensure compliance from them. This means that the demand for transparency and accountability is also dependent on whether host country stakeholders decide to enforce the rules across the board or to treat Chinese companies differently. Now, Chinese influence is characterized by its economic diplomacy, statecraft, building networks and partnership, and most importantly, by what China wants, what it can offer, as well as what the host country wants and under what conditions. For example, Latin America's participation in the Belt and Road Initiative gives insight on the multi-level dynamics and processes. However, countries are attracted to it not necessarily because it provides better deals. Instead, it is argued that the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, provides the symbolism that legitimizes the policy decisions by host country leadership by addressing domestic audiences, particularly when referring to why choosing China. As the U.S. recalibrates its foreign policy, there needs to be a recentering of Latin American stakeholders and interests. Latin American countries are not passive actors in the region and also in its relationship with China. When the U.S. is thinking about recalibrating its policy, it also needs to indicate what benefits Latin American countries will gain not only from choosing the U.S., but from distances themselves from China and not by the absence of China. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for your testimonies. I think I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and start the questioning, and then we'll go to you after. Okay. So each of you have spoken in one way or another about how the countries are not passive actors. They're each involved individually and have very specific ideas of where they're going and why they want to interact with China or the United States or whomever. Are there any examples of Chinese engagement that demonstrates a nuanced understanding, that China has a nuanced understanding of Latin American politics or missteps because of poor understanding that any of you can address?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. I think Parsifal mentioned, that China has been an extraordinarily adept student of Latin America for the past few decades. We have seen a remarkable effort and ability to sort of learn lessons and adapt based on experiences across the region, but also in recognition of changing conditions, shifting conditions within countries, political landscapes, geopolitical considerations, and China's own economic challenges at home, right? So a lot is shifting with all of this in mind. There are plenty of very specific examples of the way in which China has managed to engage the region and to shift, change, adapt its engagement in different countries based on the conditions that may be present on the ground. In those countries where there are leaders that are well aligned with China, that see themselves as strategic partners of China, we have seen historically an effort to engage directly with those leaders, sometimes in support of projects that they have put forth. That was especially prominent about a decade ago, but has become less prominent over time as Chinese companies, banks have seen some concerns about some of the projects that have been put forth and the value of those and the viability of those over time and the reputational risk that accompanies failed projects. We also see in a number of different circumstances different approaches to engaging with countries depending upon who is in a position of authority at any point in time. And so, for instance, in the case of Bolsonaro in Brazil, there was an expectation that Bolsonaro's presidency would lead to considerable drop in engagement by China, and yet we saw an expansion of economic engagement during that presidency, in part because China worked very considerably at the local level with states, with municipalities to make deals happen. And indeed, this is happening in a lot of countries across the region, especially those with federalized systems of governance and which have their own budgets and ability to strike deals. And so this is another sort of adaptive approach that we've seen more considerably over the past few years. I mean, those are just a couple of examples, but indeed, you see a different approach truly in every country. As Parsifal mentioned, right, Latin America is not monolithic, and China certainly doesn't see it that way. And even within countries, right, we see different approaches in different states and in different municipalities, depending upon their receptiveness, the opportunities. The one other thing I would suggest is that there is a staying power, there is a patience to China's engagement that is unparalleled among other actors. One example is China's, continued presence through people to people, but also other forms of engagement in Coquimbo, Chile, which has been ongoing now for 15 years in support of the eventual possibility of a tunnel project there, the Agua Negra tunnel, of copper and of space deals. And this is, resources allocated over many, many years in support of things that may never come to pass, but nevertheless are seen as valuable use of time and resources.
Anyone else want to address that?
I can add very specific examples. I think that what Margaret has pointed out, it's the more general country to country. When you see, for example, at the company level, I give you the examples of in Peru, where you have in the 1990s, Marcona, which was a complete reputational disaster for Chinese companies. And then, more or less 10 years later, with the entry of Chinalco, for example, which is a case I looked at very in depth, you can see a Chinese company that has learned from all those 10 years and has not only included, for example, domestic stakeholders in the conversation, meaning when they went to the Toromocho mine, what happened was that they engaged with the local communities. They actually continue hiring the consulting firms, right, that were from the country to talk to the communities and make sure to address those concerns or the concerns the community had. So in that regard, China has learned in saying that it's not only about what it does, but the reputation matters. And here is where it really helped shaping its image. So when we're thinking about China today, we're thinking about not only the explicit strategies, but we're also thinking about what kind of mechanisms it is using to change its image and shape the narrative that China is actually what it always presents, right? A friendly and a partner that is trying to help the different countries in their development processes.
Thank you. Commissioner Hodges.
Yeah, thank you. So you each sort of have highlighted a very important aspect here, which is subnational level activity from an educational, state, local government official level, and other local networks in various forms. Are there lessons learned that the U.S. should pay attention to as the CCP looks to replicate this type of activity in the United States, or that U.S. policymakers should focus on to try to address this throughout the hemisphere? And that's a question for each of you, since you've each kind of raised different aspects of this.
Okay, so, well, as I mentioned initially, this is a pretty large region, but I think one of the, we all mentioned, as Commissioner Price noted, about local agency, right, and the willingness of countries to diversify. That being said, there is very little expertise from Latin American decision makers when it comes to China. And these kind of sessions, conversations, I would say the only outlier here would be Chile, which is, does have the capacity and has built the policy expertise when it comes to China. That is not the case across the region. I would highlight Colombia, where it's usually China who proposes. I don't want to minimize the agency, but you don't see policy from Latin American countries. They're receiving Chinese proposals and then, they're reacting to them. They have leverage
And just to clarify that, you mean when they're receiving these proposals, is it government proposals or business proposals backed by the CCP?
Government, business, state-owned enterprises, you name it. And again, I would highlight Colombia. Just the last 4 years, it's tangible how much Chinese proposals have driven the relationship, and Colombia just responds to it, and we see this across the region. So yes, I would add that nuance to
Thank you.
to our attention.
Ms. Myers?
Yeah, I mean, this is a terrific question, and I think a seemingly timely one to the extent that we expect potentially more investment in the United States at some point. And a lot of what we've seen so far over the years, right, has indeed happened at the local level. Some takeaways, one is, as I said, the patience, right, the enduring element of this, right, long-term commitment to engaging and establishing relationships and embedding in certain communities through all kinds of different partnerships led by civil society, by educational groups, by the party in the context of Latin America. I doubt that would happen as much here, right? ILD is not prolific at all in the United States, but certainly it's a very important actor in the Latin American context. There's, and of course, all elements of government, right? There are all kinds of government entities that are engaging as well as private citizens, often in support of these initiatives and commercial ventures. The other thing I would say is that some of this goes well, right, in Latin America, and some of it doesn't. And there are some conditions that contribute to poor outcomes or better outcomes. Local know-how, local understanding of what China is looking to achieve, the ability to negotiate effectively, understanding what it takes to negotiate with China to ensure best outcomes and ensure deliverables that are indeed of benefit to the broader community is fundamental, and that doesn't always happen, I think probably here or in the Latin American context. And so that's really, really fundamental. And then, I'll leave it. I think I'll leave it as that.
Thank you. I've got another question. So Ms. Myers, you also mentioned or highlighted, and as well as others, highlighted a shift in the CCP strategy. I think you used the term recalibrating, and stated there's a genuine open related to sort of industrial development. Can you elaborate on what U.S. private sector and policy recommendations could be explored in order for the United States or some of the other allies we work with throughout the region to take advantage of this moment?
Certainly. So in my written testimony, I outlined a handful of opportunities. I think there are spaces where China is withdrawing or else is beginning to establish a presence. And I think, first of all, documenting those areas where China is so well entrenched, so well established, where there's very little opportunity for for U.S. enterprise, for U.S. companies to engage is an important exercise. And then those where China is positioning itself to assume a greater role, but where the U.S. remains a critical partner and others remain a critical partner and can maintain that presence is really fundamental. So that mapping exercise is, I think, a preliminary exercise that needs to happen. Beyond that, it's going to be a financing question, right, for U.S. companies. And in my written testimony, I mentioned some mechanisms through which we can leverage existing finance through, partnerships, strategic initiatives. You mentioned the Inter-American Development Bank as having been a mechanism through which China has engaged more extensively with the Latin American region. I believe that there has been effort to curb that and also to ensure that there is more alignment with some of the things that the U.S. is hoping to do in the region from a productive perspective. So, the IDBIC is a fundamental partner in this and one in which, capital can be leveraged in support of wide-ranging objectives that align very closely with U.S. interests. Same, of course, with the DFC, although obviously some policy would need to be implemented in order to better operationalize the DFC at this juncture.
Thank you very much. And just for the record, I am tracking the recent developments with the IDB and sort of the forward progress on this issue. Thank you.
Okay, our Commission Vice Chair, Kuyken.
Thank you, Commissioner Price. Last year, we had a hearing and focused on the issue of space. Can you, I just give it to the panel, talk about Chinese space infrastructure, space ground infrastructure in Latin America and how we should think about that?
I can briefly address that. So when we think about the space infrastructure, so China has influence or has set up places in Argentina, Brazil especially. The unfortunate thing about it is that, for example, in places like Argentina, it's very close to the public. We don't have access to it, right? But when we think about it from the commercial perspective, so here is where I think there's opportunity for the US to consider is that Brazil and China, for example, have had not only research initiatives, but also studies and even satellite programs, right, in order to build Brazil's own program. China has really stepped up in that regard, and going along with what I was saying in my testimony is that it identifies where the region is interested in looking, or countries in the region are at least interested in advancing. And in this case, right, they're not thinking about the security or the risk that it can come with it. So in this case, from a commercial perspective, from a research perspective, China helps us. China is providing the financing. China is providing the infrastructure. Right? Now, when you think about Argentina, and please excuse me, I don't have the detailed names, and that's my mistake, right? However, when we're thinking about Argentina, there are local complaints that, for example, it is a closed location, civilians cannot enter, that is the risk of military presence, but yet there is no accessibility to it. And that really has to do with, again, going with what Parsifal is saying and what Margaret is saying, right? There are opportunities where China takes advantage and countries enter not because necessarily speaking they agree that China is the best option, but because it's the option that is present there for them. I hope that my fellow panelists also have more to add to.
If I could just add to that as well, I think that's a really important characterization. You know, China has, for the longest time, suggested, right, that any sort of big country, Daguo, right, is going to have space capability, and of course has pursued that prospect with many deals struck in the Latin American context over the past few years in particular. The problem with these projects, though, and this is understood also by Latin American countries, is the degree of opacity and exclusivity that accompanies them, obviously. They are not conducted in the open, right? They do not involve extensive engagement by local actors or other international actors, as many other space-related arrangements do in Latin America. And so they stand apart in that respect and have been viewed critically even by host country governments and populations, right, as a result of these conditions. So I think the U.S. is right to be concerned about a number of these projects, about the way that they've been negotiated, what they may be achieving, and the access that they you know, or the access to information that is generated by critical information and sensitive information that is generated by some of the work that they're doing. At the same time, though, I would say we need to recognize that these countries are really interested in developing and maintaining their space capabilities. So if it's not China, to Victoria's point, then more collaboration with the United States in ways that may not be so terribly expensive, right, is something that really ought to be on the table.
Thank you, Ms. Meyer. Could we talk about critical infrastructure? We've sort of talked about it in passing, but just sort of walk us through your assessment of telecommunications efforts by China, cable, undersea cables. We had an undersea hearing recently. It was one of the big focuses was just the data that is processed under these, through these cables, ports, and then roads and sort of BRI-related initiatives. How should we think about posturing the United States to either counter these efforts or to compete?
Okay, if I may. When it comes to you know, competition, generally speaking, between U.S. counterparts and Chinese counterparts in the region, they are, to a large extent, in different camps. If you look at where most of US or Western FDI is going, it dwarfs anything China is doing. China would be around 3 to 5% of FDI over the last 3 to 5 years. US accounts for over 30, close to 40% of FDI. But where is it going? It's, Chinese FDI is very targeted, and it's precisely in those areas, infrastructure. And the US companies, Western companies in general, are largely absent, or they're actually exiting and selling assets to the PRC, as Commissioner Hodges mentioned, the large presence in the electricity sector. So at the end of the day, it's these, from local perspectives, these are vital infrastructure deals that need to be made, and we've all mentioned this. They are the ones showing up at the end of the day. They're the ones, and even there's a lot of positive projects where, Bogota Metro is one of them, but the list is quite long. So I would say the place where the U.S. can have the largest impact is on due diligence, because it's targeted, doesn't require a lot of the funding, and there's a lot of expertise in the U.S. that do this not only in Latin America but across the globe. So that could be a targeted effort, and it would be very much welcomed by governments and private sector as well.
I can add a little bit on that. I think that taking advantage of elements in which the U.S. has historical, well, to some repetitive advantage, it's very important. Due diligence is one of them. Just to give you the example of the Port of Shanghai, I know that there have been a lot of controversy, right, in the potential dual use and whatnot, but looking also at the outcomes a year later, something that has been characterized is, for example, the Peruvian government, a lot of the laws and regulations and policies that were enacted for a infrastructure project to come of such dimension to operate were pretty much made months before it became operational, or it became operational, the construction, right? So in this case, it does show that sometimes for a lot of these countries, Latin American countries, they are pursuing these deals with China, not necessarily, again, because they're perfect, because they present the best infrastructure, because they present the best, let's say, networks and whatnot for the communities around it to also benefit from it, but because, again, they are the only player. They are the players that are presenting. So for the U.S., for instance, and this is a conversation that has been happening, is that when the port was being built, they were looking for technology in terms of monitoring and supervision and whatnot, and they were hoping that other companies or from other countries would also come for the public tender and to present the deals. Nobody came, literally nobody came. The only ones that were present were the Chinese players. So I think that here is where, again, as Margaret said, it's very important to map out, right, where or the spaces that the U.S. can compete or U.S. firms can compete. Financing is an issue, but one thing that I really want to add really quickly is that in addition to thinking about the DFC and the private companies, something that Chinese or some Chinese firms have been slowly, and here's where the patience comes, right, trying to enter is, for example, private and public partnerships, PPPs. And this is a space that could be exploited, if you want to put it that way, right, to be able to share financing weights in this case.
Ms. Myers, before I get in trouble from Commissioner Price.
Commissioner Miller.
Thank you. Thank you for all for your testimonies. I thought they were excellent. Ms. Myers, in your testimony, you highlight critical minerals as maybe the most obvious area for continued cooperation and co-investment. What would you say we are doing right and wrong right now, and what are the areas you think we should be doing more of in that particular space? And this question's for any of you that are interested in asking or answering.
I've been encouraged. Thank you very much for the question. I've been encouraged by a growing emphasis and attention paid to the prospect of enhanced partnerships with Latin American countries, specifically those that have a wealth of critical minerals, lithium triangle countries, Brazil, for instance, on partnerships for, that would generate critical supply chains and improve the overall U.S. standing as concerns access to critical minerals. Making that happen is another question, right? And so the mechanisms, the institutions, the platforms need to be in place, of course, to facilitate these sorts of agreements. That starts with conversations with these countries, and all of these critical minerals sectors are managed very differently. And so it's going to be a different approach for each country, right? We'll have to engage with provinces. In Argentina, the Chilean government has a different way of handling things. Bolivia, obviously, things are in complete flux. In Brazil, I think cooperation there is going to depend largely on what happens in the political arena. But nevertheless, there are things that can happen, and I think that the main objective would be to put a reasonable deal on the table, and one that countries will be receptive to. Bringing the finance, and already we've brought in finance for certain specific deals from DFC, and I think we've done that very effectively. That is a model that I think we can continue to build upon and expand, even pulling in other collaborative capital, for instance, from CAF potentially, but especially from the Inter-American Development Bank. So I think there are many, many creative ways to get at this. Private equity is another that has been proposed, and I think is worth exploring, certainly. And already there, I believe, is some exploration of this. The one other thing I would say is, this is an opportunity to distinguish ourselves from what China is offering. China promises upgrading, right? It promises production. It promises all of these things, when it bids on these projects, and there's expected to be a factory and processing of some of these minerals, and it doesn't ever happen. It has never happened. And so, can we distinguish ourselves? Can we demonstrate that we indeed can add value and are committed to doing that? And I think that would do much to distinguish the U.S. from China at this juncture.
So I would build on that. We usually talk about, we've all mentioned, Chinese companies showing up. The private sector is never mentioned. So I completely agree with Margaret in terms of private equity, from my experience. I'll point to one specific example, the Jujuy province in Argentina. This is part of the lithium triangle. Everyone's there. Korean companies, Japanese companies, Australian companies, Chinese companies. And it is because of local legislation that has basically pushed for the attraction to attract and make investments in the province viable to companies, especially in the private sector. So here comes in, a third variable, which is, engagement with, decision makers, Senate, Congress, the equivalent of host countries, because legislation to basically, force technology transfer from the Chinese and establishing and becoming part of local value chains. This is something that Latin American countries always complain about, right? That we are rentist economies, that there's no transfer of technology, that we're just shifting, from, maybe a few decades ago from the US and Europeans and now to China, but it's always the same economic model. So Brazil is doing this, and it's doing it quite well. It's why we see these billion-dollar investments in the electric car sector. You see BYD investing, billions of dollars to set up shop there, and this has huge benefits locally. But again, this is because Brazil is a very closed economy, and it is using its own legislation to its favor. So these are areas for cooperation and having private talks with your counterparts in the region.
I could go on and on, but it looks like I'm out of time.
I think we'll have time for a second round, so we'll come back to you. Chairman Schreiber.
Good morning, and let me add my thanks to the witnesses. Really appreciate you contributing your expert opinions with us. We haven't really talked much about traditional security issues. I don't think we asked you to focus on that, but I'd be interested in hearing from any or all of the panelists on security issues, PLA activities, ship visits, arms sales, sort of the broad swath. If you could generally characterize how China's doing in the region on security issues, and if you had sort of the heat map of a very diverse, broad region, you know, are there particular countries of concern where the PLA has strong engagement, or they seem to be gaining some traction that might create future opportunities for access, et cetera? Again, just open that up to whoever might have some thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. This is another obviously critical component of China's engagement with the region, which we didn't address in much depth. We've actually been doing some mapping alongside other partners of some of this work, or these activities, and really across a number of different areas of engagement, from, you know, policing to, as you mentioned, port calls, right, exchanges, military exchanges, high-level visits by military officers and others that are influential in this domain. So really running the gamut. What I observed from that exercise, looking at it from, you know, over the past 2 decades, essentially, and how it's grown and where geographically things are distributed, is that and this will come as a surprise to no one, right, there's been quite a bit of growth, right, in all of these areas. So the policing infrastructure, as we see it, right, has grown enormously in a really relatively short period of time. And that is prolific across the region, right? It's not, I don't see one country where that really stands out, aside from maybe, there may be 1 or 2, but in general, it's everywhere, right? And I mean, with some lack of clarity, I think, about what precisely these you know, policing stations are doing. I think they serve different functions, and it's worth getting to the bottom of that, and a really critical area of study. But I mean, so there's that. The port calls also have increased. I mean, there's still PSARC, right, which is always there and has been doing, you know, a lot of this humanitarian work for a very long time, but there are more different kinds of vessels, right, that are visiting ports across the region, and in some cases doing some exchanges and military exercises in association with that. Military exercises and education itself has proliferated quite considerably, often adopting the US model, as I understand it, and sometimes being conducted in English, right, even using US materials. So that's something also that is on the rise. None of this comes as a surprise to me, right? It's very clearly articulated in all of the Chinese policy documents on Latin America, including this most recent one, and is emphasized, you know, very heavily, in fact, as part of overall people-to-people exchange, and is very much seen as part of that component. But it's achieving, I think, a lot in terms of, you know, an understanding of what it is to cooperate with China in these areas, some interest in engaging more extensively with the PLA in pursuit of wide-ranging objectives, and a real concerted effort to message on China's ability to address security issues, which of course is something that is paramount in the region at this juncture. So it's not without considerable effect.
So here I would highlight, yes, for some examples of which countries. Definitely Panama and Peru stand out, primarily because of the large Chinese diaspora for historical reasons in both countries. So these types of surveillance activities are usually or mostly directed at Chinese diaspora populations for a lot of reasons, but primarily to, you know, dominate the narrative, because as we all know, you know, the Chinese diaspora is seen from Beijing as part of the PRC. So that's definitely something to pay attention to. In terms of military engagement, I completely agree that it has been incremented, but the effectiveness and influence, I would bring it into question. This is by no means representative, but in my own engagement with military officials who have both participated in Chinese military exchanges and with the U.S. And I'm generalizing here, but usually it's quite different. On the Chinese side, it's mostly sightseeing and showing off what China has to offer, and nothing of real raw training per se. And when they themselves contrasted with their experience in the U.S., they said, look, to us, we actually do learn about security issues, and primarily because, well, A, the types of trainings and exchanges, but also because the U.S. has a much more, for obvious reasons, an understanding of the security issues across the region.
No, I just wanted to add up really quickly that I think something that Margaret pointed out that is very important is that the strategies presented by China are multi-purpose. So even though you're talking about security and PLA, right, the label that comes with is people to people, right? And that reinforces, again, the narrative and the presentation that China comes as a partner, that maybe it's helping to train your armed forces, it's helping your police groups and police bodies, but it doesn't necessarily come explicitly that it has this security component, that it has this military component. So I think that when we are thinking about these strategies, it's important to also think the labeling that comes with and the purpose that it's actually seeking. Thank you.
Commissioner Slepin.
Thank you. Thanks to our witnesses, excellent testimonies. Ms. Myers, you referred to some of the trade tensions between certain Latin American countries and China, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, confronting the consequences of Chinese industrial policy, particularly around steel, and filing some more trade defensive cases. Interested if there's a view on how China is reacting to that tension, one. And then two, just for countries like Brazil or Chile that are seeking to kind of move up the value chain in manufacturing, processing, and the like, how China's reacting to that ambition?
Thank you. I think this is, to the extent that we want to rank the most consequential developments in the China-Latin America dynamic at this juncture, this sort of trade dynamic is one that I think is going to be fundamental in shaping the relationship now and into the next couple of years. So I'm really grateful for the question. This is, it's really quite, we've seen these tensions play out in other regions. And certainly in the steel sector, they've played out in the Latin American context for quite some time. There are, many countries that are deeply concerned, and the broader Latin American steel industry has been very active in putting forward trade recommendations and advancing certain policies that are looking to protect these industries. But there is growing concern in the Latin American region as a result of China's industrial policy ongoing, right, that this will increasingly impact other industries. And indeed, some of the industries that China has cited as areas of focus are those in which Latin American countries have some capacity. So aerospace, right, is one. Another, pharmaceuticals, machinery. These are sort of the enduring and remaining, right, industrial sectors, segments of these countries that have this capacity. And so, there is deep concern that this is going to really limit prospects, not only for further industrialization, right, but encourage a deindustrialization process in certain parts of the region. Whether that plays out or not sort of remains to be seen, I think, but what we are seeing regarding your question about how China is reacting, I think China is concerned about the effects of this, right, and on its prospects, and has been working very hard to deliver a message of commitment to industrial capacity, to development, right, to Latin American interests. But it is very clear, and I think coming out of the two sessions, right, and all of the documentation that was produced, that China is doubling down on these, on this initiative, and that it has very little other option at this juncture. And so more exports, more exports of high-tech goods, but then also de minimis items, right? Everything is going globally, but Latin America is a very important market for this, and it is impacting industries and will continue to do so when we continue to hear more and more about this. And the term that I heard most recently was just inundación, right? A complete flooding. Others, of course, use dumping, right? But this is really a major problem, and I think is going to have massive effects on the structure, dynamic of the relationship in the next few months.
Thanks. Dr. Chonn Ching, you referred in your testimony to China's massive investments in clean energy and green transportation. How entrenched do you see China's presence there, and particularly from the perspective of U.S. policymakers who see perhaps that as a daunting endeavor to try to compete with? But if you can think about from the U.S. policymaker perspective, what's one or two things that you think that Congress can do, the private sector could do, to try to compete actually in those sectors with China's investments in Latin America?
Thank you for the question. I think one of the main things is to be present. I know it sounds very simple. However, the absence of U.S. firms, private mostly, right, has been characterized that in this particular sector of energy transition and whatnot, it has been absent. And while I might not necessarily tell you, you have to do X, Y, and Z, I think that just highlighting the presence is important. And as my co-panelists have mentioned, there are different economic or financial strategies that can help U.S. companies into entering the sector. Now, for instance, perhaps where they can participate, it's mostly in the helping of building infrastructure, in the building of technology. When it comes, for example, to the specific of having buses and whatnot, I think it's more difficult to do so just because in this case, China has moved, right, its manufacturing plants, for example, in Brazil, and to a certain extent, I think there were conversations in Argentina as well to build their EVs over there. And comparatively speaking, in prices, there is no competition. In fact, when interviewing different people, right, they would tell you some of these EVs, for instance, right, Chinese EVs might not last us as long as any other company and whatnot, but we can buy 2 or 3 or replace them at a much cheaper price. So in that case, right, I think that one of the recommendations is that not try to compete in the same level as China, where clearly the US does not have a comparative advantage, right? This is one of them. And again, goes back to the conversation on mapping. But in fact, to really find niche or areas where it can really do so. And in here, green energy technology plays an important role. And especially for the region, I think that something that has happened is that technology transfer, right, spillovers from Chinese companies in this regard have been very limited. And here is something that the US companies can really exploit because it really enhances this collaboration. And again, this is how the U.S. can present itself as a long-term partner, right, and not just a partner that is fixing things temporarily, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
And Commissioner Stivers.
Thank you. Mr. De Sola, I want to start with you. You wrote a lot about Venezuela in your written testimony, and my guess is this is probably the elephant in the room of any U.S. Latin America engagement these days. My question is, how do you expect China to, what is their reaction to the military operation in Venezuela, and do you believe, and can you describe how their approach to Venezuela may change?
Thank you for the question. Yes, that's a $1 million question for sure. I was just in Caracas last week, and to be honest, I think their reaction was just they're dumbfounded. It definitely caught them off guard, and my guess is they're still trying to get their head around it, and but. From all this, and this is in my written testimony, and this trajectory over 20 years, 25 years in Venezuela, I think it just gave them a lot of food for thought. And as I mentioned, that presence doesn't mean leverage, and to understanding that their presence in Venezuela was very much superficial and concentrated in a small group of people. And that's completely different. That's the center of my testimony, that when you compare it to the United States, which it's much more bottom up. And it really doesn't matter who's in government, might have sort of an anti-US agenda, but presidents, to a large extent, come and go. So I think for the time being, they're just wait and see. And this might, I would even say that they see this as even as positive, because if some sense of rule of law and institutionality comes back to the country, the few investments that they still have in the oil sector might actually, become part of. And so far, despite the tutelage that we've seen from Washington over the last 3 months, I haven't seen any signs from the U.S. government that they're not open for, Chinese participation in the country, as long as it is, out in the open and not, in back channels through dark fleets. And so that's my 2 cents.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Ms. Myers?
Might I add to that very quickly? It strikes me, and I agree with Parsifal on all of those points, but it strikes me that there are kind of 2 fundamental questions that China's asking at this juncture, and that it doesn't have clear answers to. One is, what happens to my assets, right? Not just in Venezuela, but then everywhere, because the sense is that this is not restricted to, Venezuela is sort of an example of what can happen, right, in other parts of the region. And certainly, a lot of the projects that China has already negotiated, has already invested in, and is interested in pursuing are being monitored very closely by the United States. So this is, really intensified this question of is there an ability to protect or not? There is a division on this from what I can tell, right? There are those that feel very confident that they are having these conversations with U.S. officials and that, there's a guarantee that things will more or less be protected, or those critical interests in Venezuela at least. There are others that believe that this is a really precarious moment for China, and a lot of negotiations and other things may be in question. And so, I think it's an important point of debate, and we'll see how that plays out. And the other that one hears a lot is, okay, so if we don't do anything in Venezuela, if we don't react there, if we don't react in other countries that are being potentially targeted by the United States, for instance, Cuba, what does that mean for us as, the perceived value of our strategic partnerships? And so there's a real, again, an internal debate about this too. I don't know that China has much recourse or will be taking any real actions, although one person mentioned, for instance, the prospect of delivering more finance to Venezuela, to Cuba to support certain, efforts. So I don't believe that's on the horizon, but nevertheless, there is this internal and almost existential debate about what it is that, that adds value to a strategic partnership with China. And so these 2 questions, I think, will endure, and we'll be watching carefully how they play out.
Okay, thanks.
We have an extra few minutes if anyone has particular questions. Commissioner Miller.
Thank you. I don't want this panel to go by without drilling down a little bit on Mexico. Dr. Chonn Ching, you had mentioned in your testimony that Mexico is China's largest trading partner in Latin America. Largest partner in Latin America. Assuming a core U.S. priority in the USMCA negotiations is to put substantial pressure on Mexico to crack down on Chinese investment, trade, and transshipment, what could the relationship look like in 5 years? What leverage does the U.S. have here, and what advice might you have for the USTR as they re-enter these USMCA discussions?
Thank you for the question. I think there needs to be a little bit clarification. Maybe there was some mistake in the testimony. I said that Mexico is its largest partner in Central America. Actually, the largest partner is Brazil. Now, even though it is the largest partner in Central America, actually China competes with Mexico, not only when it comes to the trade and commercial exchanges within the region, but also even to the United States. Now, to your question of what happens in 5 years, there's a lot of uncertainty. However, something to highlight, right? And here's where the agency of the countries do play a role. For Mexico, given its relationship with the United States and with Canada, having here the US, Canada, Mexico trade agreement and whatnot, it prioritizes actually its relationship with these North American partners vis-a-vis China. Now, where China is really, or has been trying to enter and make space, right, it is in infrastructure, it is in investments, not so much in trade. Because again, here is where one could see China as a friendly competitor, if you will, right? Or at least that's how it presents itself. So it creates competition and also it competes. I think that I couldn't say in the next 5 years, but at least for now, and it has historically been, the relationship goes or fluctuates between becoming closer or becoming more tense, depending on the administration that it's imposing the country. So here, Sheinbaum's administration, she has clearly dictated, or she has clearly signaled rather, that she prioritizes the relationship with the United States. So in one way, China will try to shape the bilateral relationship, but at the end of the day, it's also how the Mexican government is responding. And I think that Parsifal, in his opening remarks, right, he did say a lot of these circumstances are not necessarily driven by what China does, but because they were already existing. And in here, the historical relationship that the U.S. has with Mexico and the relationship that Mexico has developed with China, right, does present this tense dynamic that in some instances or in some areas where it can exploit its partnership with China, it will take advantage of it, but where it competes, it still competes, and where it prioritizes the U.S., will prioritize the U.S.
Any of the rest of you?
When we talk about China-Latin America relations, I always mention that there are two cases that should be treated individually, Brazil and Mexico, because of the particularities of each one, which are kind of obvious. In the case of Mexico, I just recently had a conversation with the head of a chamber of commerce constituted by basically Mexican private sector companies, and that's definitely the U.S.'s best bet. Margaret was mentioning, industrial policy. The two countries that actually do have an important industrial base that competes and is seen threatened by Chinese competitions is Mexico and Brazil. So, and U.S. companies do have a large presence in Mexico that we don't see in other parts of the region. So in upcoming negotiations, it's a general recommendation, but as bring it to the table all these, the main actors from the private manufacturing sector in Mexico. I'd say that's the best bet for basically through legislation, through local interests of the private sector, force technology transfer and instating in Mexico the largest part of those value chains that will, indirectly benefit the United States.
Thank you.
Commissioner Stivers.
So I'd like to get your views on the Shield of Americas summit that occurred, I was last week. I'd like to get your views on, well, first I would say the press reported that there was a countering China subtext to the summit, even though it didn't explicitly mention China, which I assume would be because some Latin America countries would not want that to be mentioned specifically. But my question would be, Ms. Myers, in your testimony, you described this coercive versus constructive approach to the region. Maybe start with you. How do you look at this Shield of America summit? Does it fit into that balanced approach that you discussed in your testimony? Also, which countries are more for this? Which ones are not, necessarily in favor. And I guess more important to, the work of the commission, how could this initiative be improved, perhaps legislatively, to make it, a strong U.S. approach to the region and to, dealing with China?
It's a great question. I need to look more at what precisely the Shield of the Americas is proposing down the line, and what essentially the strategy will be. But I would say that there did appear to be some degree of buy-in, largely among many of those countries where we've seen some shift in the political landscape of late and that are looking to demonstrate their alignment with the United States in some capacity from a political perspective, and also to extract potentially some degree of economic benefit from that, to include potentially the reduction of tariffs. So yes, I think there are those that are willing to consider what this might look like and how potentially it might be implemented. But I think in general, there's just a sense that there's not enough there quite yet, right? What is this? What is it proposing? And is there a constructive element? Is it purely saying no engagement with China, which I think for Latin American countries, as much as they may want to suggest that they are aligned with the United States and its interests, is a non-starter. These structural elements are so embedded that it's impossible for Argentina to adopt this trade agreement, right, that has been put in front of it, and to not have dramatic impact on its economy. That's different from Shield of the Americas, obviously. So I would say, in terms of a recommendation, it's to define this and to ensure that it's clearly articulated. What is it that it's proposing? Right? How much of what does it mean to shield the Americas, in other words, right? And is it a purely a China question, and or is it more than that? And beyond that, is there a constructive element to this? Is there something the U.S. can offer as an alternative, and indeed an alternative that is even more attractive than what China is offering? Because I believe that to be easily achievable, to the extent that we collectively, believe this to be something worth pursuing. So, that's my general recommendation, and it can be a constructive platform, but it needs to be developed as such.
Thanks. Mr. De Sola?
Well, I'm glad that you brought this up. I have a very critical view of the Shield of the Americas. I would even go as far as comparing it to other political initiatives, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's a political initiative. I completely agree with Margaret. There's no substance to it. It's, at the end of the day, it's an MOU, even, comparable to joining the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a rhetorical framework that, in my view, will not last the Trump administration. I see it as all these initiatives, and in 2000 promoted by Venezuela, which were only there because Venezuela was there to finance them, and once Hugo Chavez was done, they basically, just evaporated in insignificance. And I would just add that because it is connected to the security, framing of the Shield of the Americas. And careful how I frame this. The current scenario in Venezuela, if you see how, as a whole, the region responded, which is primarily very, very positively, and especially from a South American perspective, given the history of U.S. intervention in the region, the fact that a military operation to remove a head of state is actually welcomed by the region, I think speaks volumes of how the core issues that Venezuela represented are actually in alignment with U.S. security interests. It's migration, it's drug trafficking, it's irregular groups. And these are areas where China is not present at all. So I do see this as a narrow window to sit down with counterparts in the region to actually, dig down into what everything that Venezuela represented and bring them to the table. Shield of the Americas, I'm very skeptical, but I think at least is sending a message of from a Latin perspective that they're willing to engage.
Thanks. Ms. Chonn Ching, did you want to comment?
Really quickly, I think aside from echoing what my co-panelists have said, right, there needs to be more substance, it needs to be clear, and that goes also in time with a lot of the cautionary, I guess, presentations or assumptions or assertions that sometimes the U.S. or U.S. policymakers present to the region is that when these cautionary comments come, or when these initiatives come and the alternatives are presented, there needs to be something else beyond just saying we are an alternative. Be explicit about what you're presenting, right? But it also pushes a lot of the Latin American countries into realizing that as they sign the different deals with China, right, now I think Latin American policymakers have to make that decision that there are geopolitical consequences, or there are geopolitical actions that, or outcomes that might need to be considered. And this is something that the region itself is also grappling. But the most important part, again, really quickly, right, there needs to be clarity about what it is, what it entails, right? And not only that, in what ways Latin American countries will benefit. That's the key part, because that's not clear.
Bingo. Thank you.
And with that, thank you all very, very much for your participation this morning. We're going to take a few minutes break and come back about 11:15. Thank you.
Our second panel will explore Chinese influence at a more granular level through specific political and economic vectors of influence, development assistance, economic leverage and coercion, ports and other critical infrastructure, and security cooperation and transnational crime. We'll begin with Mr. Francisco Bencosme, former China policy lead at U.S. Agency for International Development. Previously, he was Deputy Special President Envoy for Compact of Free Association negotiations. His testimony will examine how development assistance and people-to-people engagement are part of China's broadened political influence strategy in Latin America. Francisco?
Commissioner Hodges, Commissioner Price, and other members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you. I'm here in my personal capacity as the former USAID China lead, and the views presented today are of my own and do not represent my institutions that I am affiliated with. I've been asked to speak on the evolving landscape of China's development cooperation in the region, and I would start off by making a few key points. One, it's integrating into the Global Development Initiative. China is increasingly embedding its development cooperation in the region as part of its larger ideological Global Development Initiative. This framework is found within the 2025 China-Latin America policy paper and during the China and CELAC meeting. It puts an emphasis on South-South cooperation, win-win rhetoric, common prosperity, and with an eye towards shaping the next agenda for the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Two, the Belt and Road Initiative is focusing on high-quality key sectors. BRI, in its 2.0 version, emphasizes high-quality programs that are smaller in scale, but concentrated in key sectors that China identifies as priorities, such as in renewable energy, AI, data centers, and telecommunications. Three, it's more localized. China tailors its development programs to local conditions, deepening engagement not just at the national level, but also municipal and state level. Even if the Chinese firms is global or regional, their footprint is becoming more flexible and tailored to the local idiosyncrasies, regulations, and networks. How it handles specific issues when it comes to labor conditions, subcontracting networks, and relations with clients all depend on those respective countries and sectors. Number four, it's building political resilience. To supplement its economic engagement in the region, it is also building out strong political, governance, and people-to-people tracks in the region. This means more party-to-party trainings to hedge against political transitions in the region, journalists and political leaders engaging in trips to Beijing, media content sharing agreements, and deepening its ties to educational institutions in the region. Number five, the tools are also shifting. Investing is becoming syndicated, multilateralized, and driven more by Chinese private firms than by state banks. This means that on paper, they are co-opting and partnering with Western firms, regional development banks. It also represents a level of maturity in the region where they're not as dependent on Chinese state banks for finance and having the infrastructure to bring them to larger scale. In light of this, what should the US policy be? The United States needs to articulate a positive and long-term economic vision to Latin America and the Caribbean that is built upon partnership, not dominance, for sovereignty and freedom, not an exclusion to any one country, building on the institutional and comprehensive framework for growth and competitiveness in the region. This strategy should focus on building economic prosperity, resilience, diversification, and building agency for the regions and our partners. It will require broad, bipartisan congressional action to build a well-resourced framework that cuts across multiple administrations, think 5-year plans, and extends beyond one administration. Recognizing that while the United States will be an enduring presence and leader in the region and has deep cultural people-to-people, no realistic strategy that the US will create will fully kick China out of the region. We should not play whack-a-mole projects, but ensure that our strategy is comprehensive, institutionalized, so that our partners in the region can also rise to the occasion and have predictable dialogues. We also need to right-size and prioritize the issue sets and invest a lot more on studying the efficacy of our responses as opposed to simply navel-gazing the problem set. I would focus on a couple key sectors. First, on economic financing and investment, it should ruthlessly prioritize key sectors of the 21st century, such as emerging technology, climate and renewable, and critical minerals. If everything is an economic security challenge, then nothing is. There needs to be an effective coordination and blending of different financing and investment tools like the DFC, EXIM, the Office of Strategic Capital, Commerce, USTR, and State Department. We need a one-stop coordinating body at the White House for strategic, positive, high-level economic statecraft. We need to be aggressive about supporting Western private sector competitiveness in the region. Here, trade associations play a role, but are not sufficient to deep and extensive contacts in the regions. Our embassy deal teams need to be well coordinated, know their priorities, and encouraged to take risks. Report language that analyzes how our investment process can be announced quicker and implemented faster would also be helpful to compete on the speed of delivery. The bar right now is too high and often becomes the perfect enemy of the good in terms of deal making. We should follow the COCOM model and embed liaisons from allied development agencies to ensure stronger coordination with partners and allies. Second, our strategy needs to be complemented by building political resilience against Chinese coercion by supporting investigative journalism, institutions that can check forced labor, anti-corruption reforms, and digital surveillance. We need our public diplomacy officers to think creatively in a competitive environment where China is making significant investments in local media ecosystems. Third, China is making significant inroads in portraying our policy as episodic, militarized, focused on coercion, and misaligned with the regional economic development priorities. Therefore, we need strong investment in public diplomacy, like the Fulbright programs, parliamentary exchanges, and educational investments. Fourth, we need to establish significant investment in what I refer to as sovereignty assistance. Issues like investment screening, tech diffusion, and regulatory reforms that support inclusive economic trade will go a long way in helping our partners benefit from the investment while creating guardrails. Finally, we need to give our partners choices, not force them to choose. When Barbados joined the UN at the height of the Cold War, its prime minister said, "We will not view the great powers with perennial suspicions merely on account of their size, their wealth, or their nuclear potential. We will be friends of all, satellites of none." That thinking resonates deeply today in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Ramon Escobar, Managing Director of Actum. He supports clients in finance, critical minerals, digital, and AI infrastructure and emerging technology sectors, and previously served as Director for Western Hemisphere Strategy at the National Security Council. Ramon, thank you.
Thank you. Co-chairs, commissioners, members of the commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The views I express here today are my own. China's economic engagement in Latin America over the past 2 decades has been extensive, strategic, and increasingly consequential for U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere. Beijing has pursued what I would describe as an economics-first strategy, using trade, finance, infrastructure development, and technology investment to build long-term influence across the region. Chinese state banks, state-owned enterprises, and government-aligned investors have financed ports, power grids, telecommunications networks, mining projects, and logistics corridors throughout the region. Increasingly, these investments are concentrated in sectors that form the backbone of modern and interconnected economies. China's approach to Latin America is not primarily ideological or military. It is structural. Beijing is embedding Chinese firms, financing, and technological systems into the economic architecture of the region. Despite this growing presence, the strategic environment in the Western Hemisphere still favors the United States. Latin America remains economically, culturally, and technologically aligned with the United States in ways that China cannot easily replicate. Entrepreneurs, investors, and companies across the region remain deeply integrated with U.S. markets, universities, and innovation ecosystems. The question is not whether the United States can compete successfully in Latin America. The question is whether we will prioritize the sectors where competition matters most and deploy the economic tools necessary to succeed. One emerging risk is that global crises outside the hemisphere could distract the United States from following through on its stated pivot toward Latin America. We have seen this pattern before. Events in the Middle East or other regions can quickly consume Washington's attention and resources. Recent U.S. engagement in the region has understandably emphasized security cooperation, including initiatives such as the recent Shield of the Americas Summit in Miami. These efforts are important, but security cooperation alone will not counter China's influence in Latin America. China's strategy in the region is overwhelmingly economic and technological, and the United States will ultimately need to compete in those arenas by bringing investment, infrastructure, and technology that accompanies Chinese alternatives. In my written testimony, I made three core arguments. First, China has established a neocolonial relationship with Latin America, characterized by commodity extraction, industrial dependency, and growing financial leverage. Second, the most consequential arenas for strategic competition between the United States and China in the hemisphere are emerging in three sectors: artificial intelligence and digital ecosystems, strategic infrastructure, and critical mineral supply chains. Third, the United States can compete successfully in these sectors, but only if we adopt a focused strategy centered on leveraging two of our most important strengths: our dynamic private capital markets and our innovative business ecosystem. We can do this by building strategic investment platforms that channel U.S.-aligned capital and innovation to this region. Let me briefly discuss the three battlegrounds. The first is AI and digital ecosystems. The global race for AI leadership will not be decided solely within the borders of the United States or China. It will be determined by which countries' technologies, platforms, and standards become embedded in the economies of the 78% of the world's population that lives outside of those two countries. Latin America is a critical battleground in that competition. And if we cannot win in Latin America, I'm afraid we will not win anywhere. Signals from China's two sessions meeting this year make clear that Beijing intends to expand the global adoption of Chinese AI technologies, particularly across emerging markets. Chinese firms are already promoting vertically integrated solutions that bundle chips, compute infrastructure, and software networks into a full AI tech stack. Huawei, for example, is marketing AI infrastructure built around its Ascend processors and CAN computing architecture as an end-to-end platform for countries seeking sovereign AI capacity. While Huawei's chips still lag leading US GPUs in raw compute performance, China's strategy is not to win on chip performance alone. It is to embed a full-stack AI ecosystem across emerging markets before competing systems take hold. I flew in this morning from NVIDIA's GPU Technology Conference in Silicon Valley. I attended the conference to advance a project that would help embed the US AI tech stack into Latin America's economic fabric. While I left the conference believing that my Why Latin America pitch was well received by the AI industry titans, I also know their overwhelming focus is in the US. As we have seen in critical minerals, 5G, and other strategic industries, US firms acting alone will not consistently prioritize global market competition. In sectors like AI, where rapid adoption and diffusion will determine global standards, the US government must actively incentivize American companies to show up before China's good enough and affordable model becomes the default worldwide. The second battleground is strategic infrastructure. Chinese firms have invested heavily in ports, electricity networks, telecoms, logistics corridors across Latin America. The Commission has already heard testimony outlining the many examples of Chinese influence: the Shanghai megaport in Peru, the China State Grid Corporation's inroads in Brazil and Chile, Huawei's domination of 5G. Infrastructure investments like these provide long-term influence over assets central to national economic security. These are not just commercial assets. They are the systems that determine how economies function. Control over ports, grids, and networks can translate into influence over trade routes, energy security, and data flows. Without greater U.S. investment and participation, these systems risk being shaped in ways that disadvantage U.S. interests and limit the region's long-term strategic autonomy. The third battleground is critical mineral supply chains. China has pursued a systematic strategy to secure access to Latin America's vast resources through mining investments and long-term offtakes. The objective is not simply to acquire raw materials, but to ensure that the entire value chain, from extraction to processing to manufacturing, remains anchored within Chinese industrial ecosystems. Together, these three sectors, AI, strategic infrastructure, and minerals, will define the future of economic competition between the United States and China in the Western Hemisphere. The good news is the United States has a powerful advantage in this competition: private capital. And DFC's recent authorization has fundamentally improved the agency's ability to mobilize the American capital advantage. With expanded equity authority, a $5 billion equity revolving fund, and greater flexibility, DFC can more effectively act as a catalytic investor large-scale policy-aligned investment platforms. This is a critical shift. While retaining the ability to do direct project-by-project investment is important, the United States can also help build entire investment ecosystems around strategic sectors. platforms that aggregate capital, align commercial incentives with policy objectives, and deploy at the speed of markets. And we are already seeing how this looks. The Critical Minerals Consortium, co-created by DFC and Orion Resource Partners, is a strong example. But the real opportunity is to replicate this model across sectors. It starts with DFC's expanded equity authority. Equity allows the United States to shape how capital is deployed, not just where it goes. In Latin America, DFC could anchor platforms that build US-aligned AI data center ecosystems, develop strategic infrastructure corridors, or expand regional mineral processing capacity. And there is ample opportunity to leverage other financial assets such as the US Export-Import Bank, the IDB, and the CAF as force multipliers. Ultimately, the strategic competition between the US and China will not be decided solely within our borders. It will be decided by the economic systems and partnerships we help build abroad. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Next, we're to hear from Mr. Henry Ziemer, an Associate Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His research has examined China's port projects and power grid investments in Latin America and the Caribbean. His testimony will discuss the strategic advantages China gains from investments in ports and other critical infrastructure. Thank you.
Co-Chair Hodges, Co-Chair Price, and esteemed members of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. It's an honor to speak with you today on this critical and pressing topic. In the past year, China's influence in Latin America and the Caribbean has undergone a fundamental shift. Whereas previously China's expansion in the region was often treated as a matter of consternation, but not a priority for the United States, now documents like the 2025 National Security Strategy and 2026 National Defense Strategy are firmly centering the Western Hemisphere as the foremost area of concern for U.S. homeland defense. The United States is actively engaging Latin American and Caribbean nations, most recently through the Shield of the Americas Summit and launch of the Americas Counter-Cartel Coalition. With respect to China, there's a palpable sense that the momentum has begun to shift, and Beijing's seemingly inexorable accretion of power and influence could be at risk. Just this year, the Panamanian Supreme Court ruled that 2 port concessions held by Hong Kong-based C.K. Hutchison violated the country's constitution. Mexico has also raised tariffs on Chinese imports, while China's $20 billion investment propping up the dictatorship of Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela has proven to be money ill spent. There's unprecedented opportunity here for the United States to tackle Chinese influence within our shared neighborhood and build a more stable, secure, and prosperous Western Hemisphere. However, in a sense, everything up to this point has been the easy part. Now the United States needs to think critically about how to unwind China's networks of influence, some of which are decades old at this point, and put forward a resource-backed strategy not just to compete, but to outcompete China in strategic domains. All the while, we shouldn't forget that Beijing also gets a vote, and it's shown no signs of drawing down in the Western Hemisphere. It is my contention, therefore, that in a sharper-edged competition with the United States and Latin America and the Caribbean, China is going to double down on its investments in critical infrastructure, especially ports, as a key source of durable influence. Just this week, we heard General Francis Donovan, commander of United States Southern Command, testify before the House Armed Services Committee that China's ports, quote, grant Beijing a foothold in the region and raise concerns of potential dual-use infrastructure that could facilitate intelligence gathering, cyber vulnerability, or logistical denial during global contingencies. I could not agree more with the General's assessment, but scoping risk of individual port investments has thus far proven challenging. Companies with ties to the People's Republic of China have invested in dozens of port projects throughout Latin America and the Caribbean that range from simple construction and dredging projects to full-scale acquisitions and even developing and operating greenfield projects like Chancay, Peru. Last year, my CSIS colleagues and I developed a novel methodology for calculating the risk to the United States posed by 37 different China-influenced port projects. We combined 11 different weighted indicators ranging from the involvement of a Chinese state-owned enterprise to the value of daily U.S. trade through a given port, to the presence of technologies like ZPMC cranes and Nuctec cargo scanners that have been identified as potential intelligence risks by U.S. authorities. From these indicators, we derived 2 pillars of port security risk: the level of Chinese influence at a given facility and the degree to which U.S. economic and security interests are exposed at a particular port. The findings have major implications for how the United States orients itself with respect to Chinese ports investments. For one, while Panama's recent decision to kick Hutchison out of its holdings in Balboa and Cristobal is a welcome one, Hutchison still manages 5 other port facilities in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Mexico and the Bahamas. In fact, the ports of Manzanillo and Veracruz, both in Mexico, score higher in terms of U.S. exposure risk than either Panama port, owing to the close economic integration and the importance of the U.S.-Mexico security relationship. Hutchison is still looking to sell these ports to an international consortium, and that's an opportunity that China has seized upon, demanding that its state-owned shipping company, COSCO, have a stake in any final sale. Kicking Hutchison out of the Panama Canal may have been a tactical success, but if COSCO manages to expand its influence even closer to the U.S. homeland, it could still prove a strategic loss. Looking south to Chancay in Peru, U.S. economic interests are not particularly imperiled by China's presence there, but the history of the project offers a concerning insight into China's evolving maritime strategy. In March 2024, just months before Chancay would open its gates, Peru's National Port Authority announced that an administrative error meant the country had effectively signed away exclusive rights to COSCO to operate the port, something that was in contravention of Peruvian law. In response, COSCO threatened to withdraw from the project entirely, leaving Peru with a partially built port and dreams of newfound prosperity deferred. Facing this unenviable alternative, Peru chose instead to amend its ports law, allowing for a 30-year period of exclusivity for private ports. In the process, China showcased a new playbook for wielding influence through infrastructure. While for years China's repossession of the Sri Lankan port of Hambantota has been regarded as the archetypical case study of how China has leveraged investment to meet strategic ends, today, in my opinion, that playbook looks much more like Chancay. But China is not just looking to ports in LAC. It's also growing its position in the infrastructure within and around these sites. This includes railways, energy generation, security scanners, and ship-to-shore cranes. In this way, port investments comprise a critical node in China's broader influence campaign in the Americas, where commercial investment paves the way for Beijing to advance its security and hard power projection goals. Given the challenges posed by China's infrastructure strategy, what options should the United States Congress pursue to safeguard U.S. and allied interests? First, I believe that Congress should, at a minimum, raise awareness of Hutchison's holdings in Latin American and Caribbean ports outside the Panama Canal and seek to ensure that any final agreement does not allow COSCO to expand its reach into ports in Mexico and the Bahamas. But the United States also needs to go on the offense and leverage both government actors like the Development Finance Corporation, Export-Import Bank, and Army Corps of Engineers alongside the U.S. private sector to look at where China is seeking to invest next and proactively intervene to box out PRC influence, especially in strategic geographies like the Strait of Magellan in the southern hemisphere. We must also avoid conducting naval port calls at facilities where China exercises undue influence. This past year alone, 3 U.S. warships at least have docked at facilities where Chinese companies have a presence not only in port operations, but also critical technology. This cannot be allowed to continue. Finally, the United States should shift its messaging from one of malign influence to one of sovereignty and opportunity costs. Our partners in Latin America and the Caribbean may not be as interested in what the United States has to say when it comes to great power competition or military contingencies, but they are deeply invested in issues relating to transparency, corruption, and organized crime, issues where China has not stepped up to the plate, even as its port holdings have become key nodes for illicit economies. The United States should accordingly add a port security pillar to the Shield of the Americas and work with partner governments to boost investment screening mechanisms. Thank you so much for your time today. It's an honor to have the chance to speak with you all, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Vanda Felbab-Brown, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Her fieldwork and research have covered non-traditional security threats, including organized crime, illicit economies around the world, including Mexico and the Andean region of South America. Her testimony will describe how issues of Chinese transnational crime impacts relations with regional governments and presents additional opportunities for engagement by its security services. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Co-Chairs Hodges and Price, distinguished members of the Commission. I'm grateful for this opportunity to testify. As was said, I am a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, which is a U.S. nonprofit organization devoted to high-quality independent research and policy solutions. My testimony represents solely my personal views and does not reflect the views of Brookings, its other scholars, employees, officers, and/or trustees. Over the past 2 decades, Chinese actors have expanded significantly their illicit activities in Latin America and the Caribbean. They often take advantage of the expansions of Chinese legal businesses. Yet the network of criminality goes beyond Chinese criminal groups. Indeed, Chinese legal businesses often also engage in nefarious and criminal activities in corruption and in violation of laws and procedures. The activities span a wide spectrum of illicit economies and crimes. They include drug trafficking, money laundering, extortion, human smuggling, illegal fishing, logging, mining, and wildlife trafficking. All of these economies have existed in Latin America for a long time, well before the arrival of Chinese criminal groups. So does highly violent criminality, which is not linked to Chinese criminal groups. In fact, Chinese criminal groups in Latin America, like elsewhere in the world, behave very non-violently, operating instead through corruption and the building of networks of influence. But the presence of Chinese criminal groups often leads to a dramatic increase in diversification in illicit extraction and smuggling, such as in natural resource contraband, because the demand for such products in China is very large. By connecting local illicit economies to global markets and increasing the value of commodities, Chinese criminal groups also motivate local criminal actors to expand and diversify their illicit economies. In many ways, Chinese criminal groups and the portfolio of legal activities or activities in the legal trade sector and their illegal activities serve as exemplars and models for other criminal groups around the world, including in Latin America, such as in Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, to emulate and learn from. These illicit economies perpetrated by Chinese actors and by the very many other criminal groups operating in the region represent multifaceted threats and harms to the rule of law, economic well-being and sustainability, biodiversity and environmental conservation, public health and public security. I want to emphasize once again, however, that these illicit economies and the activities of corruption and violations of rules are not solely perpetrated by criminal groups. They are also often perpetrated by Chinese legal businesses. And it is indeed this merger of illegality and legality in which both Chinese legal businesses and Chinese outright criminal groups operate that give them a high advantage in the criminal space and in building networks of influence. Let me mention a few activities in which Chinese criminal groups operate. They are crucial networks in the drug trafficking space because they continue to be the principal suppliers of precursor chemicals for the production of methamphetamine and fentanyl to Mexican cartels. Indian groups are other important sources of those chemicals. Chinese money laundering networks have become the to-go money launderers for the cartels. It is precisely the combination of legal and illegal activities of Chinese criminal actors that allows them to obscure their nefarious behavior beyond money laundering. But it also gives them tremendous advantage, both in equipping them with political capital and in facilitating a wide portfolio of money laundering methods, the most important and convenient one of which is the ability to use trade-based money laundering for moving assets. They take advantage, however, and utilize a wide variety of other money laundering methods. In extractive industries and fisheries, Chinese companies and intermediaries, as well as criminal groups, often exploit flawed licensing systems, be it inspections, fraudulent permits, and falsified documentations, poor supply chain monitoring to move illegal ore, timber, seafood under the cover of nominally legal operations. Other times, such as in fishing, Chinese flotillas engage in blatant illegality in exclusive economic zones of Latin American countries that drastically threaten biodiversity and economic resources and their sustainability. The intermeshing of illegal and legal business, the entrenchment of corruption, the weakening of regulatory and judicial institutions make it far harder for governments to transition toward transparent, rules-based governance and achieve inclusive, equitable, and accountable long-term development. And by interacting with local criminal groups and local corruption networks in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as acting on their own, Chinese illicit networks amplify the country's governance deficiencies and further weaken the already inadequate rule of law, policy autonomy, and fiscal stability. Latin American law enforcement agencies often struggle to act against Chinese criminal networks. This is both a matter of capacity, but it is also a matter of prioritization. One lack of prioritization stems from the fact that Chinese networks are not violent. Moreover, they're very effective in developing high-level political protection as well as local-level political protection. Corruption is their coin. Moreover, some Chinese criminal groups and activities also serve to advance the diplomatic influence and economic interests of the Chinese government. This thus limits the interest and willingness of the government of China to counter such corrupt practices and illegality. But at the same time, China is actively expanding its law enforcement assistance programs in Latin and the Caribbean. Yet such law enforcement assistance tend to be often skewed, one-sided, and self-serving, while it highlights, however, the low levels of violence in China and high levels of surveillance-based safety in the country. Chinese anti-crime technology systems, such as Huawei's Safe Cities, present all manner of risks, including violations of human rights and civil rights, enhanced repression, and espionage, but they are widely popular in the region. In my testimony, I detail several policy recommendations in considerable length. I will just tick off some. The first is simply helping to build countries in Latin America to develop law enforcement tools against Chinese criminal networks. And that also includes developing technological systems that can compete with Chinese technologies. But countering Chinese criminal groups needs to go beyond countering their involvement in drugs. It needs building clean, transparent, and traceable supply chains and reducing corruption and patronage system. That in turn requires that the United States itself enhances those capacities and puts very high premium on the accountability of law enforcement, on human rights, civil rights, the strength of civil society, such as investigative journalists, and the strength of specialized investigators, such as for crimes in natural resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll get right into questions. And I did just want to note that all four witnesses are new voices to the commission, so thank you for being with us today. A little bit of a framing comment, just given the bipartisan nature of the discussion today. I want to highlight two of you served in different administrations for me, but in very similar roles in USAID and at the National Security Council. We may disagree on a number of significant things, but we agree on the importance of the hemisphere, the negative consequences of the CCP's systematic efforts across the board, and the illicit behavior and criminal activity that those typically lead to. Primarily, we also agree on the importance of U.S. private sector to combating these efforts and sort of that being used as a tool. And so I would like to explore this area of sort of bipartisan alignment with you today. Beyond the tools recently provided by Congress to the DFC and the Exim Bank, what policy steps could Congress consider to go additionally further and to leverage those tools to maximize what currently is put in place, but also to go further? And so, Mr. Escobar, Mr. Bencosme, I direct this question at you.
Sure. Thank you. I think that from Congress's perspective, I think the bipartisan support for these tools has been incredibly empowering. And I think it gives comfort to our partners in the region to know that these are durable. I think we heard in an earlier panel the sort of frustration that between different administrations, there's different initiatives that come and go. But these are institutions that were created by Congress that will be consistent. So specifically, I think one of the challenges DFC still struggles with is the speed. The ability to get to market. That's part of the idea of having platforms as an investment strategy is you can do the diligence up front, and then once you've embedded your foreign policy priority into the investment platform, it can move at the speed of business. That being said, it still would be helpful to have the board delegation authority, the threshold, higher for equity and for debt. I think that a sense of Congress resolution that reflects that bipartisan support for that to give DFC a little bit more speed. I think they're very hesitant yet to move quickly on those types of decisions. And then, you know, right now we have the DFC for 7 years. You have XM coming up this year, the Congress does. And I think I don't have any specific recommendations right now, but looking at the ability for the two institutions to be more collaborative, to work collaboratively, particularly around these sort of platform strategies, I think there's probably room for exploring that further and discussing it further. Thank you.
And Mr. Bencosme, based off of your testimony, it seems very important, but how important is it for sort of American technologies to be sort of the backbone of these emerging technologies throughout the region? Could you go a little bit deeper than what you initially provided?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the point that was made earlier about you know, emerging technology is very much focused in domestically, is unfortunately resonating poorly in other parts of the world. Because it means that they're deprioritizing competing in global markets. Because China is competing in these global markets, it means that our American tech companies have to also then compete in those markets, and they have to be able to adapt and sort of figure out new innovative ways to enter those markets. I think there needs to be better coordination among the various tools of positive economic statecraft. There is a litany of different capacity building programs throughout the US federal government. My own personal experience at USAID, it was frustrating because I didn't always know what my colleagues in CBP were doing, or Exim Bank, and now State Department, or, you know, and more blending financing and using all those tools strategically by a White House body, I think would go a long way in helping coordinate and sort of implementing that, you know, sort of that coordinated positive economic vision. Right now, our vision is too militarized, negative. It's focused on whack-a-mole on a couple key projects, as opposed to looking at the overall comprehensive nature and what are the systemic and structural challenges that sectors like technology are facing in actually competing in the region, whether that's workforce, whether that's market access, whether that's a whole litany of issues, supply chain transparency. Those are the ways we have to identify the problems and then identify the tools within our US government capacity to do so. Completely agree about the congressional need to respond because one, Congress determines the purse strings. Two, they can think in longer term horizons that can go beyond any just one administration.
Thank you. Mr. Ziemer, you talked a bit about sort of ports. I want to drill down on sort of the South Atlantic. Agree with your view that looking at things through sort of an individual kind of case-by-case basis isn't really kind of conveying the full scope of the picture, the full scope of the risk. The importance of raising awareness on this risk, I think, is incredibly vital. It's part of the reason we're having the hearing today. Could you, for the commission, and as we're looking to kind of discuss this with others, walk through a little bit what that risk actually tangibly translates into so that members of Congress can understand this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think often we are over-indexed on the potential of Chinese ports to serve as basically outposts for future PRC military bases. And in some ways, I think that the risk is, right, that risk is both overblown, but the real risk is much scarier. The fact of the matter is ports are incredibly critical hubs for the global economy, and they grant you, whoever operates those ports, basically a window into the nitty-gritty, the plumbing of the global economy, with 80% of our trade that moves by sea. Being able to see who's buying what from whom, how long those timelines are taking, where it's going from, where it's being transshipped to, offers a remarkably granular insight into global supply chains. So our risk index prioritizes pretty heavily how much U.S. trade exposure is present at a given port. We also do look at military capabilities, but we look at it mainly actually from the U.S. side. So how much does the United States rely on a port for security cooperation, for naval port calls in the region, and how much intelligence could China pick up about, you know, U.S. standard operating procedures, patterns of life, while U.S. warships or security assistance forces may be at that port. So it requires kind of a multifaceted thing, and the last aspect I'll drill down on is that kind of overlays this is the network effect. That the more ports you control, the more control you have over the global economy. It's more than the sum of its parts. And one quick example would be we saw last year U.S. antimony ordering a shipment of antimony that's critical for ammunition manufacturing for defense industrial supply chains, order a shipment from Australia to a smelter in Mexico. But that shipment passed through the Chinese port of Ningbo before going on to Mexico, where it was stopped and delayed and ultimately sent back to Australia, where it was revealed the shipment had been opened and potentially tampered with. Now imagine that instead of transiting through China, it's transiting through a Chinese operator-owned port in the Western Hemisphere. The ability to snarl these supply chains and really throw a spanner in the gears of the global economy is incredibly dangerous. I think something that deserves more attention.
Perfect, thank you. Would you just, sorry, I think I'm almost out of time, but would you consider this to be a sort of an increasing bottleneck that the Chinese are getting control over?
I certainly think that Chinese state-owned enterprises, the latest wave has been the PRC's SOEs going out and cementing control over especially critical ports, also notably moving into like specialized terminals for agriculture, minerals, and oil exports. I think that's an evolving trend we're seeing in China's strategy. That's quite concerning in my opinion.
Thank you. Co-chair.
Thank you. And thank you all for your testimonies today. I want to piggyback on Commissioner Hodges' last question. So we talk about the security risks, whether it be at ports or smart city tech or connected vehicles or what have you. How cognizant are the leaders of these countries in the region about the security risks, the data risks, security risks, or the security risk at large? How does that factor into their conversation?
There's a lot of awareness about the geopolitics of many of these sectors. For better or worse, the heightened geopolitics globally has very much registered into many of the LAC countries' psychosis. I think where it differs, though, is the trade-offs. So this population, this community needs power. A port can drastically change the competitiveness, the economic trajectory of my country. How do I weigh that versus a potential future risk of a Taiwan contingency? Or how do I factor issues of surveillance when my people need to eat every day, to talk about agricultural programs? So it's not a lack of awareness, although I do recommend that one potential recommendation is to maybe declassify more information, intelligence sharing with our partners. I think that could help, especially when it comes to what's happening in other regions as China's encroachment and footprint continues to increase. But I do think that it's a difficult decision, and oftentimes our partners are having to make those trade-offs and that risk management every day. I do think there's high awareness.
Let me come in on that as well. I would like to echo the comment that there is sometimes limited awareness. More frequently, there are choices and there are alternatives, and delivering immediate results in something like critical infrastructure often tends to trump potential security considerations. But the other aspect is that Chinese businesses, state-owned or private, are often very adroit in developing networks of influence that subsequently minimize the concerns. And so a lot of counter-narrative is also put forward. Thus, the United States, in my view, will not be effective if it preaches to Latin American and Caribbean countries not to do so without offering alternatives that are both technologically, financially feasible and present, but that also clearly guard against issues such as human rights violation and repressions, other systems that technologies in infrastructure, in security, be criticized in China as potential high risks.
Yeah, I do think that there's a relatively high degree of awareness. One example very recently was in Costa Rica when President Rodrigo Chavez's government changed the requirements for the 5G bid tender. that essentially prohibited Huawei from participating in that bid. And there was a lot of pressure, and there were reports, public reports of economic threats, of different types of pressure campaigns from the Chinese to change that. There was political pressure domestically in Costa Rica, but I think President Chavez understood the risks that were associated with that and went ahead with it. Another, this is more an anecdote I heard. The mayor of a very large city in Latin America described how when Huawei shows up to pitch their 5G wares, it's the Huawei, the finance, the government, the diplomats, everyone shows up, a delegation of 15 folks from Beijing coming to town, whereas the Western alternatives send a regional sales representative. I thought that captured it really well.
I'll echo the comments. I think in Latin America, there's sort of a more refined sense of what the U.S.'s red lines are. So I've heard, for instance, people, representatives of regional governments who have traveled to China and they've gotten, a Huawei phone, and they said, "Oh, I need to throw this out because the U.S. will be mad at me if I'm, texting on that." So there's a sense that we shouldn't do these partnerships because the U.S. will be concerned about them, but not really. I think that one layer deeper, which is we should be concerned about this for our own cybersecurity and for our own data integrity. And I think actually Costa Rica is a great example of this, where the Chavez government faced a massive cyber attack that took down government services that was tied to Russia. And now if you're allowing Huawei to come in and build your 5G backbone, you're exposing yourself to even more potential disruption down the line. That's the kind of messaging and rhetoric that I think the United States can do a better job of drawing out, being more localized.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Commissioner Stivers.
Going back to the DFC, Mr. Ziemer, you had a really interesting recommendation in your testimony, and I wanted you to expand on this. You said the DFC should explore partnerships with U.S.-aligned ports and consortiums, and take a minority stake in those ports, and make sure that those ports that are managed cannot be sold to PRC companies or use sensitive technology. Can you expand a little bit more on that recommendation and how that would work in reality?
I'd be happy to. So one of the key innovations of the DFC's reauthorization was its expanded equity stake, its ability to take equity up to 40%, I believe, in companies. But we should acknowledge that the DFC is not a slush fund, and that building or buying major ports is a multi-billion-dollar endeavor. If we try to compete everywhere, we're going to run dry pretty quickly on this. So instead, what we can do is actually take a page, I might say, from almost China's playbook, where they're trying to get Costco to have a minority stake in Hutchison ports with what are called veto rights. It's unclear exactly what that would be, but some sort of arrangement, presumably to safeguard core PRC interests. We can replicate that with US-aligned firms, Carix, DP World, PSA, that operate constellations of ports around the world. And the DFC can come in with an equity stake and say, as a condition of our, we'll provide this to you. As a condition of that, you are going to rip and replace any NUCTEC scanners you have, any Huawei or Hikvision cameras, security cameras, and you're going to give us right of first refusal if you're going to sell this port to another company. And I think that's a way to dramatically, I think, punch above its weight in terms of the funds and financing available to the DFC.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's a great recommendation. So engagement with Latin America, does not always need to be seen in this U.S. versus China framework. And frankly, I think that's very counterproductive. I think our goal is not to dominate Latin America. Our goal is just to make sure the region is not dependent on China in a way that hurts our national security interests. So with that in mind, are there things that we can do more multilaterally? And I'm thinking of the Inter-American Development Bank that help decrease Latin America's dependence on China in a way that works with the region. Should we be strengthening our support for that institution? Are there other institutions that we should be working at a higher level with the region multilaterally, as opposed to unilaterally in so many cases, where we sometimes just don't have the political will to do the things in terms of engagement that China is doing? I don't know, Mr. Escobar, you want to start?
I can jump in quick. I do think that there's a tremendous opportunity. As I think most people here know, the U.S. has a 30% stake, the largest stake in the IDB. I think we've let it get too distant from us over the years, and I think that there's a strong will for the United States to be the lead partner in that relationship. There are already capabilities and tools that are available. For example, there's a legal framework, an agreement between the DFC and the IDB Invest, to be able to share diligence, share pipeline, co-invest, work together on those types of deals. They're very complementary to what the DFC has in the sense that they have 100+ people on the ground. DFC has 2, I think, in the region. So sourcing pipelines, diligencing deals, there's a lot of complementarity. We have a lot more dry powder than IDB does, and I think that's good. And then also going back to this platform concept where you can crowd in private capital that brings different value. So for example, in the critical mineral space, when I speak to private investors who are thinking of coming into Latin America to invest in critical minerals, when I describe that, hey, one of the capital partners you can have in your capital stack is the actual sovereign governments of the region, and they're part and parcel to this investment, that's very appealing, especially to other sovereigns, like think the Middle East, to know that they have local government partners that have exposure through the IDB. So it's a very powerful and catalytic tool that I think we can use more as a partner, we can use more effectively.
What would that, I mean, is there a way to look at that legislatively? Like, I mean, I'm a former appropriator, so the first thing I think of is increasing the contribution to IDB. But are there other things you think we can do legislatively to strengthen IDB or the U.S. role in IDB?
I think the supporting IDB Invest, I would say the private sector arm, I think is important. I think it was I'm not entirely sure, but I think during President Obama's administration, we did not participate in the last capital increase. And the U.S. participation in IDB Invest went from 30 to 15%, and China went from 0.something to 5%, which I think was a strategic kind of mistake. I think trying to rectify that would require Congress's involvement. And again, I think where there's a lot of value for Congress is to demonstrate the bipartisan support for that type of partnership, those type of things. Like the sort of legal framework that I was talking about, that IDB Invest and DFC can co-diligence and do these things together, that's focused on debt. Let's expand it. Let's do it across the equity structures. Let's do it on insurance. Let's do it in different areas where they're going to deploy billions of dollars into the region every single year. Let's see how we can work together to ensure that more and more of those billions of dollars are doing it in our shared goals, our shared interests.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Shriver. Oh, sorry, Slevin.
All right, take it. Thanks to the 4 of you for your testimonies. I wanted to go back to the AI conversation a little bit, maybe Mr. Escobar. Interested in just starting with you, any observations about AI adoption in Latin America, among institutions, among general populace, and 2, what role Chinese companies are playing on the ground to increase its presence in AI ecosystem?
Yeah, so one thing that I think it's always very important to frame when you talk about technology and adoption in Latin America. Latin America is a very technology-forward region, despite the fact that it's a developing country. For example, Latin America has produced more unicorns than the developing countries of Southeast Asia, despite having a smaller population and less venture capital. The ecosystem in general is also more closely tied to the U.S. ecosystem. So there's a lot of the sort of unicorns, the early unicorns, particularly in the fintech space, were part of the PayPal mafia or came through different U.S. investments and then brought that experience to Latin America. So there's a lot of connectivity and there's a lot of embrace of it. I think that, and it's not going to be any different with AI. I don't know if it's because it changes so quickly, but a few months ago, I think Brazil was the 3rd or 4th largest user of ChatGPT, for example. It's certainly an economy there. And this is where I'm very nervous. I'm very nervous as a national security professional, former, I should say, national security professional, is I think that we don't understand how important it is to be present in these ecosystems, especially at the early stages. All the startups that are out there in Latin America right now that are capital starved are looking for a US option, and there aren't any. And so DD is quietly, the Chinese firm is quietly putting $1 billion to work over the next few years in Latin America. And with DD will come DeepSeek, will come different applications, AI native companies from China that will support them, and will come control through capital. And I don't know if we've put a solution on the table yet that is sufficient. But what I do know is that these VCs, many of whom I know personally in this ecosystem, they will take, even if it's not as good of a deal, they will take the US deal any day, because that's the tech stack they want to be aligned with.
Mr. Bencosme?
Yeah, just wanted to add that the digital Silk Road means that everything that China does in Latin America is now having increasingly a more digital component. So your ports are becoming upgraded with digital technology. The Internet of Things means that everything from financial, transportation, public goods are becoming more and more digitized with Chinese infrastructure present. Over half of Latin American countries also have some kind of digital agreement now with China. So they're not only embedding the infrastructure, the know-how, but also increasingly bringing people and supporting human capital. That's through educational investment, so that people are increasingly growing up with digital Chinese standards, and then ultimately enter the workforce in some of the big Chinese tech companies that are now present in Latin America. And they're also increasingly thinking about it in the context of energy. China is building the first data center in Brazil. So it's not only a competition about the infrastructure, but how do you support and provide energy for that infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and China is providing the answer to that question.
Thanks. Mr. Ziemer, anything to add?
Sure, just a quick addition. One thing I'm very concerned about the use of AI for in Latin America is for crime. We've seen Latin American cartels using financial fraud, online scams, leveraging AI for a lot of these applications. I think the next phase is leveraging AI tools in synthetic drug manufacturing. And the nice thing about US AI companies is that they're based in the United States, and they generally seek to tamp down on some of these frontier risks. When it comes to China, we don't have that visibility. We don't have that oversight. We don't have those cooperation mechanisms to determine whether or not a Chinese model is contributing to sort of criminal enterprises in Latin America.
Dr. Felbab-Brown, anything to add, or do you share that view?
I think there is certainly a risk. Look, it's inevitable that all criminal groups around the world with some level of capacity will be adopting modern emerging technologies. They are. The risk is what kind of safeguards, or the flip side of that is what kind of safeguards are put in place. I think there is an advantage in US-based platforms where there is presumption of more cooperation. And at the same time, emerging technologies are also going to be used by law enforcement forces. And we are seeing Chinese-based AI platforms often outcompeting US or Western systems in Latin America for various reasons, one of which is that the Chinese systems come without any demand on privacy protection, human rights protection, civil liberties protection, and can be understood to allow themselves to become tools of repression. However, I don't think a good US policy would be to start presenting US systems and US policy focus as now ignoring the issues of human rights, democracy, or civil liberties. Just the opposite. The most effective anti-crime approach is one that centers on rule of law and that encourages many actors internally as well as externally to buy into systems of rule of law.
Thank you for your responses. Commissioner?
Commissioner Shrivers.
Thank you, and thank you to our witnesses. Really appreciate the statements and the thoughtful recommendations. I want to ask about an issue that really hasn't come up much, but I want to take advantage of your expertise. From the perspective of U.S. interests, how important is it that Taiwan maintain the diplomatic relations that it has or even grows it? Obviously, this is of high interest to Taipei, but from U.S. interest standpoint, should we be actively working to help them sustain what they have, or maybe even, I mean, the newly inaugurated president of Honduras campaigned on switching relations back to Taiwan. Is this something that we should be promoting proactively? Is that a way to counter China's malign influence, or is this simply a cross-strait thing that we should stay out of from your perspectives?
I'm happy to take a first shot. So the greatest number of Taiwan's remaining diplomatic allies are in Latin America and the Caribbean. I was down in Guatemala just last month actually talking to people about their relationship with Taiwan, which is still quite strong, I think, but China is definitely making inroads and regards Latin America as sort of the jewel in the crown for isolating Taiwan. I believe that Taiwan's diplomatic allies are a national security priority for the United States. I believe that Taiwan's continued recognition by 12 countries around the world is a key diplomatic deterrent to China's efforts to continually cast this as purely a domestic security issue where the PRC in Beijing has free rein. So I think the United States should be actively involved in countering Chinese malign influence in Taiwanese diplomatic allies. And I do think that seeking to try and make some switches happen should be an objective. The case, you mentioned Honduras, where President Nasrias Fura on the campaign trail did say he would consider switching back the recognition because Honduras hasn't really gotten that much out of China so far. In my opinion, the real thing is most of these countries won't do it alone. They would want to do it with other countries together, and they won't do it without U.S. support, without U.S. guarantees that the U.S. will help them weather the storm. And I think, relating back to countries like Costa Rica, which changed and have had sort of a fraught relationship with China ever since in 2007, they're very afraid of China's penetration into the digital economies there, into critical infrastructure, and also on continued dependence for Chinese investment. So I believe that this is one area where China's infrastructure investments are really going to be hard to extirpate. But I do think that the United States should be seriously considering which countries in the region might be next to switch back to Taipei.
So I think by congressional law, it's required that the U.S. is promoting Taiwan's international space. When I was at USAID, we would regularly convene our Taiwanese partners. Taiwan's an important development actor in Latin America. I don't think it should only be viewed through the prism of strategic competition or cross-strait issues. I think Taiwan is an integral development partner in the region in and of its own right. I also wanted to say that we noticed both financial incentives being linked to people switching diplomatic recognition, and then also when that debate was live, China used coercive means before that switch to make that choice clearer and starker for many of our partners in the LAC region. My recommendations would focus more on U.S.-Taiwan trilateral cooperation on development issues. We need to push Taiwanese companies and partnership with companies in the region, and also pushing for their international engagement in regional and multilateral institutions like the IADB, OECD, and also increasingly talk about them as a model alternative, especially on technology issues.
I would reiterate that last point in particular. I think that, as we think about, we prioritize which sectors are the most important that we should focus our competition and that will have the biggest impact on U.S. national interests, and I fully agree on the ports piece as well. I think where can we crowd in Taiwan and Taiwanese companies that have additionality, not just capital, but they bring something else to bear to the equation. I think that's particularly valuable.
Thank you. I'll yield back my 12 seconds.
Thank you. Commissioner Miller.
Thank you. Mr. Escobar, you shared with us an anecdote earlier and mentioned the need to prioritize U.S. sharing of the vertical tech stack. Is that a region-wide recommendation, or do you think some countries are better prioritized to protect that tech from inadvertently going out the back door to adversaries? So help us think through this, the risks here.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question. I do think that when it comes to the highest end processors, the ones that are the most sensitive to ensuring the compute stays with U.S. aligned actors, I think that you would need to do it by country. And I think you would want to have a pretty in-depth bilateral conversation around that and who the end users are and how that will open up to the local ecosystem. Most of the highest end high compute chips will likely have a U.S. tenant, like either a neocloud or a large LLM, an OpenAI or Anthropic or someone behind it. But I think there's tremendous value if we can also demonstrate that high-end tech, we can bring it to bear for the local economy. And that's what I was getting at with the U.S. the VC ecosystem in Latin America is so vibrant that I think if we opened up some of the best technology to some of these companies, they are already sort of U.S. aligned. Another little anecdote, there was a VC fund that I knew where one of the biotech firms in the portfolio had taken a Chinese check early, and then it came to the U.S. market and got a call from CFIUS. And the last I heard that they had to divest that Chinese piece, and that really hurt the company. So there's a tremendous amount of sensitivity to those type of risks, especially because many of these companies either want to list in the U.S. eventually, like Mercado Libre and Nubank and all these guys, or they want to expand to the U.S. market. And so I think it's a sort of a natural advantage where you're going to find that alignment, but we do have to do our due diligence. And that would be the important role of the executive branch.
Thank you. Mr. Ziemer, help us better understand the investment screening architecture across Latin America. My understanding is that there is no CFIUS anywhere, but there are in certain countries, whether it's Brazil or Mexico or Colombia or Chile, some sort of screening apparatus that other countries have nothing. Explain, are there levels? How should we look at this from a category standpoint? What do some countries need to do much more of? Make us smart on this.
Yeah, thank you for that great question. There's no, as we say, CFIUS equivalent in Latin America. There's no agency that, like Ramon was just talking about, where a country would come in with a problematic part of its supply chain and immediately get a call to divest from that. They want to go further. There are, in particular, attorneys general that play a role, economic attorneys general. We saw in Chile, for instance, which I think has one of the more robust regimes, an investigation launched into the acquisition of energy distribution by Chinese companies. The investigation ultimately allowed 2 Chinese companies to acquire more than half of Chile's electricity distribution, but the fact that it was undertaken, I think, is an encouraging sign. The U.S. and Mexico actually have an agreement, signed a letter of intent or a memorandum of understanding in 2023 to stand up a CFIUS equivalent in Mexico. I haven't seen much progress on that, but that's something I think maybe more congressional action could be useful to spur that forward. And so, broadly speaking, I think that we need to do a better job mapping where the real vulnerabilities are, where the countries that are at the most risk of potential problematic Chinese investments, and we need to prioritize those. And I think also Congress can play a role here in legislative strengthening, right? Government to government, legislature to legislature exchanges to figure out how are countries framing their laws around who can invest in these pieces of infrastructure. And the final thing I guess I'll say is I'd be really interested to get a look at some of these tenders that China is outcompeting us on, because I don't believe that U.S. companies aren't able to compete on these. I think that I'm wondering, if there are aspects in there, if there's language in there that is problematic as a reason why U.S. firms don't think they're bankable. And if we can tell countries, hey, if you adjust that, if you write your tenders in this way, you'll get a lot more interest from the U.S. and other actors. You won't have to keep going to the Chinese.
If I can add something here, significant environment is the broader legal infrastructure and the rule of law quality. The more the United States encourages investigative work, independent oversight from independent inspectors, strengthening judicial capacities of investigative bodies within judicial capacities, of prosecutors, of investigative journalists, insisting on the adoption of Foreign Corruption Practices Act equivalents, and strengthens and drives those home at home, the more it will be able to address a variety of issues, such as Chinese legal investment with problematic consequences or outright criminality.
Thank you.
Commissioner Miller. I'm sorry, Kuiken. Commissioner Kuiken.
You're doing great, Commissioner Hodges. Is it Ziemer or Ziemer?
Ziemer.
Ziemer. You have the voice of a guy that's on NPR. I'm sure it's not the first time you've been told, but it is incredibly jarring to hear the morning edition guy in my ear. I used to work on the Armed Services Committee staff for a number of years, and I handled two accounts for a long time. One was the Southcom account, and the other was the AFRICOM account. And I've traveled extensively in both regions, and you've been saying one of the things we heard every time we traveled, which is presence. Everyone said you got to be there, and you got to be there persistently. The thing that I sort of observed over the years as I moved on from the AFRICOM and Southcom accounts is that we generally are not present. And I know the purpose of this is to sort of figure out ways for the United States to be more present, to counter China, to compete with them in this space. I'm trying to think about what the floor looks like, though. And by that I mean, we're going to sort of go through peaks and troughs in what the United States does in Latin America. And so what should we sort of consider or orient as the floor, as the bare minimum? Because that is essentially what is going to happen. And so what are those key elements that you think are most vital to preserve, to maintain, to sort of fight for? It's sort of a dark view to take, but as you think about the peaks and troughs, if you orient to what the floor is, you can sort of figure out how to maintain something. And all four of you are welcome to comment.
I can give a first reaction, and I think it's infrastructure. I think this is partially why China has been so, it's critical infrastructure, ports, electricity generation, distribution, telecommunications, and increasingly AI. Because when you're invested in large-scale infrastructure projects, you lock in a certain level of engagement. In the United States, you lock in that engagement with mainly through the private sector, right? And I think that the private sector is always going to be, I think, more engaged, administration to administration, regardless of sort of the peaks and troughs in political attention. If the private sector is there, that's durable influence. In China's case, it's the state-owned sector that's helping it to lock in these investments. For instance, China Harbor Engineering Company helped Jamaica build a $450 million road revitalization project. As part of that, CHEC gets toll revenue for the next 50 years. It's a multi-decade long kind of presence in Jamaica. It's light, but it's there. So I think in terms of guesstimating where the floor is, it's how much are U.S. companies invest in the region's critical infrastructure, ports, energy, telecommunications.
I think I would focus on the sort of the three battlegrounds that I outlined in my testimony. I think it's AI and digital ecosystem, it's strategic infrastructure, and critical mineral supply chains. And I think that honestly, the dry powder that we have in DFC right now and the complementary support that we have with XM and the multilaterals, if we coordinate, consolidate, I think that's plenty of capital, particularly if we're using equity to sort of embed our interests into those in the long run.
Francisco, I'm going to give you the last word. We'll go to the hybrid virtual person first, and then to you.
I would couple with enduring present, also enduring principle. It is both important that policy doesn't shift radically from one extreme to another extreme, that it is based around sustained direction, but that it is also coupled with sustained principle. This is what will allow the United States to outcompete China by far than anything else. China and Chinese actors might be able to cultivate networks of influence, networks of corruption, but they will be eventually countered. They will face pushback. Sustained development of principles such as rule of law, accountability, transparency is what will buy most enduring sustainability to policy, along with sustained present engagement.
I would think about it also in the context of both USG presence and then also strong immigration diaspora ties to the region. The fact that there's only 2 DFC officers in the whole region. Meanwhile, China has a vast network of development and deal-making professionals, I think speaks to part of the problem. The fact that we withdrew so many development officers from the region last year, not only officers, but people that, like foreign service nationals. So we were embedding our development network through the experts who had deep contacts with the ministries of economic ministries that were super important to help cultivate those relationships. All of that infrastructure is now gone. And then the second piece is just like, this is the biggest region that has the biggest growing population in the US. How can we leverage that, not in a securitized fashion, like we're not going to convert them into intel ops, but like how can we leverage them? Remittances are a huge part of the development story in Latin America. How can we think about that strategically in a way that makes sure that our presence is there, even if the people don't wear the American flag every day?
That's super helpful. Am I allowed to do one more, Commissioner Hodges, so I don't do a second round? So thank you for all the responses, super helpful. The challenge, or no, the dynamic that I always saw when I was in Latin America is there's always this conversation that's sort of like, when we do security assistance, do we think about police first or military first? Or do we think of some sort of combination of both? I just welcome your views on it and then sort of juxtapose that with what we see the Chinese doing. And then the last question I was going to throw at you, if I remember it, which I may not, foreign commercial service. We're talking a lot about DFC, but the foreign commercial service is one of these entities that's inside of the government that I feel like we sort of dramatically underappreciate. And these, the purpose of these folks is literally to promote American businesses. What's your assessment of their deployment across the region to the extent you're familiar with it? Thank you, Commissioner Hodges, for your latitude.
Perhaps I can start on the question of police versus military. I think that developing effective police investigative structures connected to effective judicial prosecutory capacities is absolutely fundamental. Military assets might be utilized to hit a drug lab. They might be utilized to hit a drug lord, perhaps drug lord who now also operates in illegal timber, illegal gold. But they are not going to get at the political actors within the country that protect them, at the foreign intelligence network, foreign business networks that enable that corrupt government official. And the more we shrink our focus simply on military action toward addressing the complexity of criminality, its increasing embeddedness in legal trade, in political structure, the more we are bound to lose both to criminals and to China.
I think on the military versus, I agree on the focus on sort of the strengthening of the rule of law as the first base principle, and I think that's particularly important in the context of China because China exploits that vulnerability. On FCS and on foreign commercial service, where I see commerce playing a really important role is communicating what the needs are, where in the U.S. are our supply chains most vulnerable. There isn't an agency that I know of that has a better sense of that across multiple industries, and then deploying that in line with what platforms should we be building with DFC, and commerce is part of like informing that decision and then working on the ground to identify who the right partners are.
So China doesn't see a distinction between military and police accounts. First and foremost, it's about development. It's not even just economic. It's now development, global South-South cooperation as their main foreign policy priority. The fact that development expertise is relished in the Chinese system as opposed to, only a military first kind of approach to the region is, I think, a really stark one, and one that, as we think about trade-offs and appropriations, really important for us to account. I think if I could use an example, two examples. One is that in Kenya, we had an ambassador who focused very aggressively about jobs, jobs, jobs. The entire embassy team, both from the Foreign Commercial Service to the State Department econ team to the USAID team, was aggressively trying to find ways to increase private investment. That kind of ethos needs to cut across. It was implicitly about China, but first and foremost, it was about the Kenya people. Second, particularly in the Caribbean, learn from what we were doing in the Pacific Islands. We were aggressively thinking about how can we support a bit more presence, not about creating embassies and having long conversations about the cement should go here but not there, or how much it would cost. Can we put people in hotel rooms, whatever it means, so that there's more US presence in some of these smaller islands. We have one regional offices for what has come up as increasingly one of the most important parts of the world, just given how the recognition for Taiwan, but also they're our neighbors, right? So how can we support presence in more creative and innovative ways? Because I feel like just looking at one tool misses the overall comprehensive picture.
Thank you. Commissioner Brands.
Thank you. I have just one question, which I direct to all of the panelists or any who care to answer. You've all done sort of a wonderful job sketching out the challenges that the U.S. faces vis-a-vis Chinese influence in Latin America, and it's a sobering picture. And so I'm curious, is there a particular success story you think it's important to highlight of either the U.S. or regional countries pushing back against that influence in constructive ways in the areas of your concern? And I'd be interested in any and all examples of that. Thanks.
Perhaps I can start again. I think one area where we are seeing a lot of opportunity and pushback is in the domain of illegal extraction of resources or unaccountable, and particularly illegal fishing, where countries across the region uniformly are complaining concerns about the extent of illegal IUU fishing by China, sometimes not even comprehending the risks that Chinese fishing fleet pose also in terms of espionage, and asking for cooperation from the United States. Cooperation such as partnership agreements with the Coast Guard to develop not simply maritime awareness, but crucially maritime response capacities. But once again, I think that we need to both harness this willingness, this approach, this interest to demand greater accountability also from the countries in Latin America toward themselves, their own fishing fleets, toward the broader infrastructures of fisheries and sustainabilities, even as we direct this interest and this demand and request for the US help against the external actors.
So in Guatemala, we invested a lot on diversifying their coffee market. When the Guatemalan parliamentarians went to Taiwan, coffee was one of the biggest exports that was hit by Chinese coercion. Luckily, they had resilience and diversification because of decades of USAID investment. I think that's a success story. Second, in Costa Rica, because DFC, Exim Bank, and our COCOM commander were heavily focused on supporting an alternative to Huawei, we were able to save off that sort of switch in terms of a 5G tender. But it really required high-level attention, and you just can't do that at the scale that China is competing across the board. And third, this is a different kind of example, but Brazil is one of the top recipients of development assistance from China, but is not a Belt and Road Initiative country. That is because Brazil and Mexico see themselves ultimately at some point being competitors in the developing global South. So, and Brazil has pushed back in a couple cases by saying, hey, if you're gonna invest here, you need to support in our manufacturing, you need to have more local content rules, and creating enough safeguards in order to push back against Chinese development cooperation. How can we enable that kind of resilience, diversification, and new regulations to help our partners push back against this type of investment?
I'll give one quick recent example. This year, actually in 2026, the DFC made an investment in Cerro Verde rare earth mine in Brazil. They were able to do this despite the sort of diplomatic tension that's been there. And they did it with a really innovative equity and debt structure that creates a long-term relationship with that particular asset, and I think it's a good model going forward. I think the other thing too to this question, though, just taking a step back, the Latin America's political left and right are different, I think, today than if you look back, say, 50 years. The political left, with some exceptions, is generally interested in having U.S. investment come to their country. They generally want U.S. technology in their country. I heard this myself when I was in the National Security Council from the left, from leftist presidents. And then on the right, I think, although there's clearly an affection between some of the leaders in Latin America and President Trump, the affection runs deeper than that. It runs deep, it's with the United States. It's with the pro-capitalism, free market view. And I think that is just a massive advantage, and why I think in 2026 I'm bullish on hearing a lot more examples of pushback and embrace of the U.S. model, assuming we come up with alternatives.
I'll give maybe, I wouldn't call it quite an unalloyed success story, but I think Panama actually is a remarkable, a very interesting case study where we saw, Panama launched, obviously the U.S. has made very strident rhetoric about China's influence around the Panama Canal, about needs to take it back, that I think was received quite poorly in Panama and did damage our reputation there. But at the same time, Panama's Auditor General launched investigation into the Panama Ports Company that C.K. Hutchison owns, and found that they had left hundreds of millions of dollars on the table that the company had basically defrauded Panama out of from its revenue sharing agreements. So what was a geopolitics and national security story in the United States, in Panama was a story of corruption and malpractice by Hutchison. And that was ultimately the genesis that led to the Supreme Court case that kicked Hutchison out of these two ports. In the meantime, the United States has signed a number of agreements with Panama to strengthen security cooperation, to do rotational access to different basing facilities, to do more joint trainings. So I think there's, maybe it's a sort of an all's well that ends well story here to talk about. But I do think the story, Panama is the most remarkable case in which a China-influenced port in the Western Hemisphere was taken off the table. And it took both U.S. and Panamanian cooperation, not coercion, to get to that point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Commissioner Stivers has a second round of questions.
Okay, I know we're short on time. So, Mr. Bencosme, as you can attest, USAID played an absolutely critical role in countering and competing with China in Latin America and indeed all over the world. With the dismantling of USAID, are there specific initiatives or programs that can be resuscitated at the State Department or in a new entity that have fallen by the wayside? And one that I think of that we mentioned is the trilateral cooperation on development with Taiwan. I don't know if that still exists, but are there certain initiatives like that that would more directly compete and counter China that you think maybe we need to bring to the attention of Congress to resuscitate?
Yeah, so great question. Thank you for it. Power Africa was a really fascinating initiative because it created the flexibility and put more deal-making in an important continent. We need to be able to replicate that in the context of the Americas because increasingly electricity, energy, and infrastructure competition increasingly has an energy and green angle to it. So if we can replicate that model to the region, I think that would be really important. Second, we talked about the footprint issue as well, about taking in foreign service nationals and embedding them as part of our development strategy in the region is, I think, a really important idea. Third is that we had development agreements. And when I talk about the Global Development Initiative, it should be seen in the context of a war of ideas. They're embedding the multilateral system with ideas about win-win, global South cooperation to replace or reform the international system that we built. Development agreements is how you get back at standards about norms, about local content rules, about the gray warfare that's happening around development cooperation that, frankly, we were starting to do at USAID, but I worry has fallen by the wayside. I also ran what's called the Countering PRC Influence Fund for USAID. It was flexible, and that flexibility I used to empower our missions on the ground so they were thinking innovatively, because not every ambassador has the expertise on what China content laws are happening in BYD. But throwing a little money at the problem helped everyone come back to me, and they were like, I found a way to work with the Taiwanese that we never thought about until you told us that you would give us money to do more trilateral cooperation. So really leveraging assistance to encourage the interagency process and supporting our people on the ground, I think is a really important lesson learned.
Thank you.
All right, I just want to thank everyone again for coming today. This has been an incredible testimony. I think really underscores some of the serious issues facing the hemisphere. So thanks again to all of you and for the first panel. Clearly, we've got a unique moment of opportunity ahead of us, and hopefully we can empower Congress to put forward those tools and maximize the impact. So just want to say thank you. I've just handed a note also. Our next hearing is scheduled for Thursday, April 16th, relating to China's role in the global commodities markets. So tune into that. And with that, we are adjourned.